China, 4th century before the Common Era. The land stretches vast and broken, a patchwork of competing kingdoms locked in perpetual conflict. The Zhou dynasty, once the unifying force that held these territories together under a mandate from heaven, has fractured into pieces. What remains is not one China but 7 major states and countless smaller territories, each ruled by ambitious lords who claim legitimacy through force, through lineage, through whatever argument might secure their power for another season. The roads between these states are dangerous. Armies march constantly. Refugees flee from burnt villages. Scholars wander from court to court, selling their ideas to whoever will listen, trying to answer the most urgent question of their age. How do we survive this? This is the Warring States period, and it will last for more than 2 centuries. The violence is not abstract. Conservative estimates suggest millions died in this era, either in battle or from the famines and epidemics that followed armies across the land. The state of Qin alone is said to have killed hundreds of thousands in single campaigns. These are not metaphorical wars. They are existential struggles where entire populations are displaced, where cities are razed, where the losing side soldiers are buried alive or made into slaves. The terror of this age shapes everything that follows in Chinese thought. Into this world of blood and ash, a different kind of idea begins to emerge. Not a call to arms, not a plan for stricter laws or more severe punishments, not even a moral system built on ritual and obedience. Instead, something quieter, a suggestion that perhaps the problem is not that we lack control, but that we are trying too hard to control. That perhaps strength comes not from rigidity, but from flexibility. That perhaps the path forward is not to impose order on chaos, but to understand the natural patterns already present in the world and move with them rather than against them. This idea will come to be called Daoism. Its origins are uncertain. Its central text may have been written by one person or compiled by many. Its most influential philosopher may have been a minor government official who chose poverty over prestige, or he may be a literary invention. But the ideas themselves will prove remarkably durable. They will shape Chinese governance, inspire poets, guide painters, inform medicine, influence military strategy, and eventually spread across the world, though often in forms barely recognizable from their historical origins. This is not a story about mystical wisdom or ancient secrets. This is a historical investigation into how a particular set of philosophical ideas emerged from specific conditions, how they evolved through centuries of political change, how they were suppressed and survived, how they were institutionalized and transformed, and how they continue to be reinterpreted today. We will follow the evidence. We will distinguish between documented history and later legend. We will examine the actual texts, the archaeological discoveries, the political context, and the human experiences that shape this tradition. The story begins not with a sage on a mountain, but with the collapse of order and the desperate search for alternatives. To understand Daoism, we must first understand the world that created the need for it. The 8th century BCE marks the beginning of the end for the Zhou dynasty. The Zhou had ruled for centuries through a feudal system where the king granted territories to various lords who owed him allegiance. These lords, in turn, granted smaller territories to their own vassals. The system depended on everyone honouring their obligations, on ritual propriety, on the belief that the Zhou kings held the mandate of heaven and deserved obedience. But by 771 BCE, the system is breaking down. The Zhou capital is sacked by invaders and disloyal vassals. The king is killed. His successor moves the capital eastward to Luoyang, but the damage is done. The royal house has been humiliated. Its military power is broken. Its prestige is shattered. The feudal lords who once bent knee to Zhou authority now realize they can act independently. The period from 71 to 476 BCE is called the Spring and Autumn period, named after a chronicle that records an endless succession of wars, assassinations, betrayals, and diplomatic maneuvering. The Zhou kings continue to exist, but they are figureheads. Real power belongs to whoever can seize it. Then in 476 BCE, even the pretense of Zhou unity collapses. The spring and autumn period gives way to the warring states period. 7 major powers emerge. Qin in the west, Chu in the south, Qi in the east, Yan in the northeast, and Zhao, Wei, and Han in the center. These are not minor principalities. They are large, sophisticated states with bureaucracies, taxation systems, standing armies, and ambitions. Each believes it can conquer the others and reunify China under its own rule. Each is willing to do whatever necessary to achieve this goal. The warfare transforms. In the spring and autumn period, battles were fought between noble chariot warriors who followed certain codes of conduct. By the warring states period, armies number in the hundreds of thousands. They are composed mainly of conscripted peasants, not aristocratic warriors. The nobility still commands, but the fighting is done by farmers pulled from their fields, given minimal training and marched toward enemy territory. The scale of slaughter increases exponentially. After the Battle of Changping in 260 BCE, the victorious Qin army reportedly executed 400,000 captured Zhao soldiers. Even if this number is exaggerated, the fact that it was recorded and believed tells us something about the era's brutality. The economic impact is devastating. Warfare requires resources. States develop increasingly sophisticated taxation systems to extract grain, labor, and military service from their populations. Census records become crucial for determining how many soldiers can be conscripted, how much grain can be requisitioned. The state reaches deeper into village life than ever before. Families who once managed their own affairs according to local custom now find themselves subject to standardized laws, registered in government records, liable for duties they cannot refuse. The social order fractures. The old aristocracy sees its status challenged by a new class of administrators and advisors who rise through ability rather than birth. Meanwhile, many people who once lived stable lives find themselves displaced by war, forced to flee as refugees, or pressed into service far from home. The villages they leave may be burned by enemy armies or their own government's scorched earth policies. The certainty of the old order, even if that order was hierarchical and unjust, is replaced by chaos and unpredictability. Yet this terrible age also produces extraordinary intellectual ferment. Later scholars will call it the period of the 100 schools of thought. The phrase is not literal, there were not exactly 100 distinct schools, but it captures the proliferation of competing philosophies. When the old certainties collapse, people search for new answers. When rulers are desperate for strategies that might give them an advantage, they become willing to listen to unconventional ideas. Scholars who might once have served in hereditary positions now travel from state to state, offering their services to whoever will employ them. These itinerant intellectuals face real hardships. They travel on foot or by cart along dangerous roads. They are often poor, dependent on the patronage of nobles who may discard them if their advice proves unpopular or unsuccessful. Some die in poverty. Others are executed when their patrons fall from power. But they also enjoy an unusual freedom. Without the rigid structure of the old order, they can question fundamental assumptions. They can propose radical alternatives. They can debate each other in courts and marketplaces, testing their ideas in public discourse. Several major schools emerge from this ferment. The Confucians advocate a return to ritual propriety, moral cultivation, and proper relationships between ruler and subject, parent and child, husband and wife. They believe the chaos can be ended by restoring the virtues of the ancient sage kings. The Mohists advocate universal love, opposition to aggressive warfare, and elevation of the worthy regardless of birth. They organize themselves into disciplined communities and sometimes serve as military engineers. The legalists advocate clear laws, strict punishments, and the concentration of power in the ruler's hands. They believe humans are fundamentally selfish and must be controlled through reward and punishment. The logicians examine language and logic, questioning the relationship between names and reality, and gradually another voice emerges. It is quieter than the others. It does not promise to end the chaos through stricter adherence to ritual, or through universal love, or through harsh laws. Instead, it questions the entire project of imposing human will on the world. It suggests that the constant striving for control is itself the problem. It points to natural processes, the way water flows, the way seasons change, the way plants grow, and suggests these might be better models than the schemes of human rulers. It advocates what it calls Wu Wei, non-forced action, doing things in harmony with your natural patterns rather than against them. This philosophy does not spring fully formed from nowhere. It has roots in earlier Chinese thought, in the nature-oriented spirituality of the southern states, in older ideas about cyclical change and cosmic patterns. But it takes coherent shape during the Warring States period, shaped by thinkers who are responding directly to the violence and instability around them. The chaos of the age is not incidental to Daoism's development. It is the catalyst. The common narrative presents Laozi as the founder of Daoism, composing the Dao De Jing in the 6th century BCE and establishing the tradition's core principles. But historical investigation reveals a more complex picture. Many of the ideas later associated with Daoism were circulating before any identifiable Daoist school existed. Understanding these proto-Daoist currents helps us see Daoism not as the invention of a single sage, but as the crystallization of various intellectual and cultural streams. The earliest traces appear in the Book of Changes, the I Ching, portions of which date back to the early Zhou period. This text, which began as a divination manual, contains ideas about natural transformation, the interplay of opposing forces, and the importance of aligning human action with cosmic patterns. While not explicitly Daoist, the I Ching's emphasis on change, balance, and the limits of human control prefigures later Daoist thinking. Confucius himself is supposed to have studied the I Ching extensively, showing how these ideas permeated early Chinese thought across different schools. In the state of Song, a thinker named Song Xing taught ideas that sound remarkably proto-Daoist. He advocated limiting desires, accepting one's circumstances, and cultivating inner tranquility rather than seeking external achievement. Song Xing appears to have been active in the late 4th century BCE. Later sources describe him as advocating that being insulted is not disgraceful, a radical rejection of the honor culture that dominated aristocratic society. While we have no complete works by Song Xing, references in texts like the Zhuangzi and Zhuangzi suggest he developed a philosophy of quietism and acceptance that challenged the activist ethics of both Confucians and Mohists. Another important precursor is Shen Dao, who lived in the mid-4th century BCE and served at the Jixia Academy in the state of Qi. Shen Dao is often classified as a legalist because of his emphasis on the importance of Shi, positional advantage or strategic power. But he also developed ideas about Wu Wei and governance. Shen Dao argued that a ruler should not rely on personal virtue or intelligence, but should establish a system that functions effectively regardless of who occupies the throne. This requires the ruler to practice non-action, allowing the system to operate according to its own logic rather than constantly interfering with personal decisions. This political application of Wu Wei predates the Dao De Jing's more general philosophical treatment of the concept. The southern state of Chu provides another crucial source of proto-Daoist ideas. Chu occupied the Yangtze River Valley, a region geographically and culturally distinct from the northern Chinese states. Chu had its own religious traditions featuring shamans, nature spirits, and ecstatic rituals quite different from the more sober ancestor worship of the northern states. The Chuzi, or Songs of Chu, a collection of poems from this region, shows a fascination with nature, cosmic journeys, and spiritual transformation. The most famous of these poems, the Li Sao attributed to Qu Yuan, describes mystical travels through the cosmos and encounters with spirits. While not philosophical texts, these poems reflect a cultural sensibility more oriented toward nature and transformation than the ritual and hierarchical concerns dominant in the north. Some scholars argue that Daoism represents the philosophical articulation of this southern Chinese cultural orientation, while Confucianism crystallizes the values of the northern aristocracy, hierarchy, ritual, ancestor reverence. Daoism gives voice to a different set of values more characteristic of the Yangtze Valley: naturalness, spontaneity, individual freedom, mystical experience. This may oversimplify a complex cultural geography, but it captures something important. The Dao De Jing, and especially the Zhuangzi, show strong connections to Chu culture, and many early Taoist figures have southern associations. There is also evidence of hermit traditions predating formal Taoism. Throughout the Warring States period, some individuals withdrew from public life to live in mountains or remote areas, rejecting the corruption and violence of court politics. These hermits were not necessarily philosophers. Some may have been disgruntled officials, others peasants fleeing taxation or conscription, still others individuals temperamentally unsuited to social life. But the hermit became a cultural type, admired for rejecting worldly success in favour of a simpler life closer to nature. Later, Taoism will idealize these figures and develop elaborate philosophies justifying withdrawal, but the practice predates the philosophy. Agricultural life itself may have contributed proto-Taoist ideas. Farmers understand the importance of working with natural rhythms rather than against them. Planting must align with the seasons. Irrigation must follow the land's contours. Forcing crops to grow faster or in unsuitable conditions leads to failure. The concept of wu wei may be rooted in this practical agricultural wisdom. Effective action means acting at the right time and in the right way, not simply applying maximum force. A philosophical tradition that emerged in an agricultural society would naturally draw on these observations. Finally, there is evidence of interest in Yangsheng, nourishing life, long before formal Taoism. Various practices aimed at health and longevity appear in early Chinese texts: breathing exercises, dietary recommendations, sexual practices, physical movements. These are not yet systematized into comprehensive programs, but they reflect a concern with vitality, with maintaining the body's natural energy, with avoiding premature death. Later Taoism will incorporate and elaborate these practices, but they exist independently first. All of these currents, the philosophical quietism of Songxing, the political wu-wei of Shendao, the nature spirituality of Chu, the hermit tradition, agricultural wisdom, and health practices, circulate through Warring States China before crystallizing into recognizable Taoism. They represent a cultural substrate, a set of ideas and practices available to be organized into a coherent philosophy. What we call Taoism emerges when someone or some group draws these disparate elements together. Adds distinctive innovations and presents them as a unified alternative to the dominant schools of thought. This process of crystallization centers on two texts, the Dao De Jing and the Zhuangzi. These works transform scattered proto-Taoist ideas into a coherent philosophical vision. But who wrote them? When? Under what circumstances? These questions lead us to the most mysterious figure in Chinese philosophy. Laozi, which translates as Old Master or Old Child, is the name attributed to the author of the Dao De Jing and the traditional founder of Taoism. But establishing the historical reality of this figure presents enormous difficulties. Unlike Confucius, whose life and activities are documented in multiple early sources with reasonable consistency, Laozi exists in a fog of uncertainty, contradiction, and probable legend. Our earliest substantial source for Laozi's life is Sima Qian's Records of the Grand Historian, written around 100 BCE, at least 4 centuries after Laozi supposedly lived. Sima Qian, the great historiographer of the Han Dynasty, was meticulous by ancient standards, but even he expresses uncertainty about Laozi. In his biography, Sima Qian presents 3 different possible identifications for Laozi, acknowledging that he cannot determine which is correct. The first and most famous identification is Lao Dan, an archivist or keeper of archives in the Zhou court. According to this version, Lao Dan lived in the 6th century BCE and was consulted by Confucius, who was seeking information about ancient rituals. After their meeting, Confucius supposedly praised Lao Dan's wisdom, comparing him to a dragon. This story serves an obvious polemical purpose for Taoists. It makes even the great Confucius acknowledge the superiority of Taoist wisdom. Most scholars treat the meeting between Confucius and Laozi as fictional, a legend created to establish Taoism's credentials. The second identification Sima Qian offers is Lao Laozi, also from the 6th century BCE, a hermit who wore rough clothing and who wrote a book in 15 sections discussing the uses of the Taoist school. Sima Qian provides almost no other information about this figure. The third identification is Dan the historian, an official in the Zhou court who lived over a century after Lao Dan, the 5th century BCE. According to Sima Qian, this Dan observed the decline of the Zhou house and eventually departed westward. At the border pass, the guardian requested that he write down his teachings, and Dan composed a book in 2 sections discussing the meaning of the Tao and its virtue, consisting of more than 5,000 characters. Then he departed, and no one knows what became of him. This third version provides the most detail and has become the standard legend. The old master, disillusioned with the corruption of the Zhou court, leaving civilization behind, pausing at the western border only long enough to record his wisdom before vanishing into the unknown. It is a powerful story, perfectly suited to Taoist themes of withdrawal and transcendence. But is it history? Probably not. Multiple aspects of the story raise doubts. First, the idea that a philosophical text would be composed at a border guard's request in a single session seems unlikely. The Dao De Jing shows signs of careful composition, of ideas refined through much thought. Second, the claim that Laozi then disappeared without trace is narratively convenient but historically suspicious. It conveniently explains why we have no other information about him. Third, no contemporary or near-contemporary source mentions Laozi at all. Confucius is discussed by Mencius and Zhuangzi, his near successors in the Confucian school, but early Taoist texts like the Zhuangzi do not treat Laozi as a historical founder figure. In fact, in the Zhuangzi, which was compiled in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, Laozi appears as a character in several stories, but these read like philosophical parables rather than historical records. In one famous story, Laozi reprimands Confucius for his attachment to ritual and social conventions. In another, he encounters a border guardian named Yin Ji, possibly the model for the guardian in Sima Qian's account, and discusses philosophical matters with him. These stories use Laozi as a mouthpiece for Taoist ideas, but they don't treat him as a historical person in any reliable sense. Some scholars have proposed that Laozi was not a person at all but a title or collective name for a school of thought. The name itself, meaning old master, could be a generic term for an ancient sage rather than a personal name. The Dao De Jing may have been compiled by multiple authors over several generations, with later tradition attributing it to a legendary founder to give it authority. This theory gained support from textual analysis of the Dao De Jing itself, The text shows signs of compilation, repeated phrases, contradictions, shifts in style and focus. Some sections seem to address rulers and offer political advice. Other sections seem aimed at individual self-cultivation. Some passages are poetic and mystical, others are pragmatic and even cynical. This diversity could reflect a single complex thinker, but it could also reflect multiple authors or a long process of accretion and editing. Archaeological discoveries have complicated the picture further. In 1993, excavations at Guodian in Hubei province uncovered a tomb dating to about 300 BCE. Among the artifacts were bamboo slips containing philosophical texts, including 3 bundles containing material from the Dao De Jing. These Guodian texts represent the oldest known versions of passages from the Dao De Jing, predating other manuscripts by centuries. But the Guodian version differs significantly from the received text. Some passages are absent, others appear in different order. The text is divided differently. Most strikingly, the Guodian version lacks many of the more mystical passages about the Tao and focuses more on ethics and governance. This discovery suggests the Dao De Jing existed in multiple versions during the Warring States period and was still being edited and expanded in the 3rd century BCE. The text was not yet canonical or fixed. Different groups may have possessed different collections of Laozi's sayings or teachings, and the text we know today may represent a later standardization of these various strands. In 1973, archaeologists discovered another early version at Mawangdui, in a tomb sealed in 168 BCE. This manuscript, written on silk, contains 2 copies of the Dao De Jing that are significantly different from both the Guodian version and the received text. The Mawangdui versions reverse the order of the 2 main sections, placing what is usually called the Di section before the Dao section, hence calling it the De Jing rather than Dao De Jing. They also contain variant characters and phrasing. These differences suggest the text was still fluid even in the early Han Dynasty. What can we conclude from all this? Historical certainty about Laozi the person is impossible. He may have been a 6th century archivist, a 5th century court historian, or a wholly legendary figure. The name may refer to a single individual or to a lineage of teachers. The most we can say is that by the 3rd century BCE, texts attributed to Laozi were circulating. These texts contained distinctive philosophical ideas that would come to define Daoism, and later generations constructed a biography for their supposed author to give him the authority of great antiquity. This uncertainty need not diminish the Dao De Jing's significance. The text exists, regardless of who wrote it. Its ideas have power, regardless of their precise origin. But the uncertainty is itself philosophically interesting. Daoism, which teaches the importance of namelessness and the limits of language, is founded on a text attributed to a figure whose very existence is uncertain. The tradition begins with an absence, a gap, a mystery. Perhaps this is fitting. The Dao De Jing, also known as the Laozi after its supposed author, is one of the shortest and most influential texts in world philosophy. In its standard version, it consists of approximately 5,000 Chinese characters divided into 81 brief chapters. Despite its brevity, it has generated more commentaries and translations than almost any other Chinese text. But what is this text really? How was it composed? How has it been transmitted? What did the earliest versions look like? The traditional story, as we have seen, claims the Dao De Jing was written in a single session by Laozi at the border pass as he departed from civilization. No serious scholar accepts this account. The text shows clear signs of careful composition and revision. Its 81 chapters fall into 2 major sections. Chapters 137, which focus on the Tao and are thus called the Dao Jing, and chapters 38 to 81, which focus on De, virtue or power, and are called the De Jing. This division is ancient but not original to the text's composition. The Mawangdui manuscripts, as mentioned, reverse this order, suggesting the standard arrangement was standardized only later. Each chapter consists of short, often cryptic statements. Many are poetic, using parallelism, rhyme and rhythm. Others read more like philosophical arguments or political advice. Some chapters seem complete in themselves, others seem like fragments. The text employs various literary devices: paradox, metaphor, aphorism and analogy. Its style is dense and elusive, leaving much unsaid, requiring the reader to fill in gaps and make connections. The philosophical content is radical. The text challenges fundamental assumptions about value, action, knowledge and power. It praises what society usually despises: weakness, emptiness, but lowness, softness. It criticizes what society usually praises: strength, fullness, striving, hardness. It suggests that the way to survive and flourish is not to compete for dominance, but to occupy lowly positions, not to assert oneself forcefully, but to yield and adapt, not to act artificially, but to follow natural patterns. The text's political philosophy is especially striking given its warring states context. While other schools were advising rulers on how to strengthen their states, defeat enemies, and expand territory, the Dao De Jing suggests that the best government is minimal government, that the wisest rulers make their presence barely felt, that true strength comes from restraint rather than aggression. The Tao never acts, yet nothing is left undone, one passage states. This is Wu Wei, the central Taoist principle: effective action that does not force or strain. But the text's mysticism is equally important. It speaks of the Tao as the origin of all things, existing before heaven and earth, nameless and formless, the mother of the 10,000 things. It describes the Tao in negative terms. It cannot be named, seen, heard, or grasped. Any attempt to define it fails because language and concepts are inherently limited. The text thus employs a kind of negative theology, pointing toward an ultimate reality that transcends linguistic capture. This combination of political pragmatism and mystical metaphysics gives the Dao De Jing its unique character. It can be read as a manual for rulers seeking to govern effectively with minimal coercion. It can also be read as a guide for individuals seeking to live harmoniously by aligning themselves with cosmic patterns. It can be read as a critique of Confucian moralizing and Mohist activism. It can be read as poetry. This multivalence has enabled the text to speak to diverse audiences across centuries. Understanding the text's transmission is crucial for understanding its meaning. For most of Chinese history, the Dao De Jing was known primarily through versions from the 3rd century CE, when the philosopher Wang Bi produced an influential commentary and edition. Wang Bi's version contains 5,250 characters and is divided into 81 chapters, arranged in the standard order with the Dao Jing first. This version became canonical and shaped how Chinese readers understood the text for nearly 2,000 years. Then came the 20th century archaeological discoveries. The Guodian bamboo slips, discovered in 1993 and published in 1998, revolutionized Dao De Jing studies. These slips come from a tomb in Hubei province that can be dated to approximately 300 BCE based on other artifacts and historical context. This makes them the earliest known physical evidence of the Dao De Jing, written perhaps 150 years after the text's composition, possibly earlier. The Guodian tomb belonged to a minor aristocrat or educated official. Among the bamboo slips were copies of multiple texts, including Confucian and Taoist works. The Taoist material appears on 3 separate bundles of slips, containing passages that correspond to 31 chapters of the received Dao De Jing, about 2,000 characters total. But the Guodian version shows significant differences from Wang Bi's text. First, the chapters appear in a completely different order. Second, some chapters that appear in the received text are absent from Guodian. Third, some passages are phrased differently, using different characters or grammatical structures. Fourth, and most significantly, the Guodian version lacks many of the more abstract metaphysical statements about the Tao. The passages present focus more on ethics, governance, and self-cultivation. This has led some scholars to argue that the metaphysical philosophy of the Tao was added later, and the earliest Dao De Jing was primarily an ethical political text. However, this interpretation faces difficulties. The Guodian version represents only about 40% of the complete text. The tomb occupant may have owned only a partial copy, selecting passages relevant to his interests or needs. Just because certain metaphysical passages are absent from this tomb doesn't mean they didn't exist elsewhere at the same time. Nevertheless, the Guodian discovery proves that in 300 BCE, the Dao De Jing still existed in multiple forms and had not yet been standardized. The Mawangdui manuscripts, discovered in 1973, come from a tomb sealed in 168 BCE. This makes them about 30 years later than Guodian, but still 300 years earlier than Wang Bi's version. The tomb belonged to the wife or mother of a marquis, and it contained numerous texts written on silk, including 2 complete versions of the Dao De Jing. The Mawangdui versions are labelled Text A and Text B. They differ from each other in minor ways and differ more substantially from Wang Bi's version. Most dramatically, they reverse the order of the 2 main sections, placing the De Jing before the Dao Jing. They also divide the text into 81 chapters, but with different chapter breaks than the received version. Some passages are expanded, others condensed. Certain key philosophical terms appear with different characters. For example, one of the most famous lines in the Dao De Jing is usually translated as "the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao." The key term Chang, usually meaning eternal or constant, appears in Wang Bi's version. But in the Mawangdui texts, this character is replaced with a different character that means something closer to ordinary or conventional. This changes the meaning. The Tao that can be spoken is not the ordinary Tao, suggesting not that the Tao is timeless, but that it is extraordinary or special. Such variations have significant interpretive consequences. These manuscripts show that the Dao De Jing remained fluid through the Han Dynasty. Different lineages preserved different versions, and it was only later, probably during the Wei and Jin dynasties in the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, that a standard text emerged. Wang Bi's edition, with his philosophical commentary, became authoritative partly because of its intellectual quality, and partly because subsequent scholars built on it rather than seeking alternative versions. The question of authorship becomes even more complex in light of these discoveries. If the text existed in multiple versions with significant variations, was there ever a single original text? Or was the Dao De Jing from its inception a fluid collection of sayings and teachings that different communities preserved and arranged according to their own understanding and emphasis? Perhaps Laozi refers not to a person but to a textual tradition, and writing the Dao De Jing was not a single event but a process spanning generations. Modern scholarship employs various methods to analyze the text. Linguistic analysis examines grammatical patterns and vocabulary to date passages and identify possible layers of composition. Statistical analysis looks at patterns in rhyme and phonology. Comparative analysis examines how Dao De Jing passages relate to other Warring States texts. None of these methods provides definitive answers, but together they suggest the Dao De Jing reached something close to its current form by the 3rd century BCE, though it continued to evolve for several more centuries. What we can say with confidence is that by the Han Dynasty, the Dao De Jing was recognized as a foundational text of a distinctive philosophical school. Scholars studied it, rulers consulted it, and commentators interpreted it. Its influence would only grow, but its meaning was never fixed or singular. Each generation has read the text through its own concerns, and found different insights. This interpretive openness is itself very Taoist. The text, like the Tao it describes, cannot be pinned down to a single definitive meaning. The word Tao is perhaps the most important and most misunderstood term in Chinese philosophy. In modern popular usage, especially in the West, the Tao is often described as a mystical force, a cosmic energy, or a spiritual presence that pervades the universe. But what did the term actually mean to ancient Chinese thinkers, and specifically to the authors of the Dao De Jing and related texts? The character Tao itself is quite concrete in origin. It depicts a head or face atop a road or path. The primary meaning is simply road or way, a physical path one travels. By natural extension, it came to mean the method or manner of doing something, the proper way to proceed, the correct course of action. The Tao of carpentry means the proper technique of woodworking. The Tao of governing means the principles of good government. Every skill and every activity has its Tao. This usage appears throughout early Chinese literature long before philosophical Taoism emerged. Confucius speaks of the Tao frequently, meaning the proper way to live ethically and the proper way to organize society. The Tao in Confucian thought refers to the moral path established by the ancient sage kings and preserved in ritual and tradition. It is something to be learned, followed, and transmitted. Hearing the Tao in the morning, one can die content in the evening, Confucius says, indicating the Tao's supreme importance. Mohists, legalists, and other schools also spoke of the Tao, each defining it according to their philosophical commitments. The Tao was not initially the property of any single school. It was a common term that everyone used. The distinctiveness of philosophical Taoism lies not in using the term Tao, but in how it redefines the term. The Dao De Jing transforms Tao from a common noun into a philosophical absolute. It makes the Tao not simply the correct path for human action, but the fundamental principle or pattern underlying all existence. The text begins with the famous statement, "The Tao that can be spoken of is not the constant Tao. The name that can be named is not the constant name." This opening immediately establishes the Tao as something beyond ordinary language and conception. What is this Tao? The text offers multiple descriptions, none of them straightforward. It is the origin of heaven and earth, existing before them. It is empty yet inexhaustible, producing all things yet possessing nothing. It is invisible, inaudible, and tangible, yet nothing can exist without it. It is soft and weak, yet nothing can overcome it. It is lowly and base, yet all things depend on it. These descriptions work through paradox and negation, pointing towards something that cannot be directly captured in positive statements. In chapter 25, the Dao De Jing attempts a fuller account. There is something complete and formless, born before heaven and earth, silent and empty, standing alone and unchanging, pervading all without becoming exhausted. It can be regarded as the mother of the world. I do not know its name. I style it Tao. This passage establishes several key attributes: priority, existing before creation; transcendence, standing alone; immanence, pervading all things; and fundamentally ineffability, lacking a true name. The maternal imagery is crucial. The Tao is not a creator god who deliberately fashions the universe. It is more like a womb or source from which things naturally arise. It does not command or control, but nourishes and sustains. This aligns with the Dao De Jing's broader preference for feminine, receptive, yielding qualities over masculine, active, aggressive ones. The Tao is the mysterious female, the valley spirit, never dying because it never asserts itself. The relationship between the Tao and the 10,000 things, a classical Chinese expression meaning everything, is one of natural emergence rather than intentional creation. Things arise from the Tao not because the Tao wills them to exist, but because this is the Tao's nature. Chapter 42 describes a cosmogony. The Tao gives birth to one gives birth to two gives birth to three gives birth to the 10,000 things. This suggests a process of natural differentiation, the undifferentiated Tao, giving rise to progressively more complex and multiple forms. But the Tao is not simply the origin. It is also the pattern or regularity observable in natural processes. Water flows downward, plants grow toward light, seasons follow each other in order. These patterns are not imposed by conscious design, but arise naturally. They are expressions of the Tao. To align with the Tao means to recognize and follow these natural patterns, rather than fighting against them. This is where the Dao De Jing's philosophy becomes practical. If the Tao is the pattern of natural processes, and if things flourish when they follow their natural patterns, then wisdom consists in understanding these patterns and acting in accordance with them. For a ruler, this means minimal interference, allowing people to live according to their nature, rather than imposing artificial regulations. For an individual, this means cultivating simplicity and spontaneity, rather than forcing oneself into unnatural behaviors. The concept of returning to the Tao appears repeatedly in the text. All things emerge from the Tao and ultimately return to it. This is not described as a cosmic tragedy, but as a natural completion. Returning to the root is called stillness. Stillness is called returning to destiny. Returning to destiny is called the constant. Death is not an evil to be feared, but a natural part of the cycle. Anxiety about death comes from attachment to the manifest, differentiated state rather than acceptance of returning to the undifferentiated source. The Tao is thus both cosmological principle and guide for living. It describes how the universe operates and prescribes how humans should conduct themselves. Or rather, the prescription follows from the description. Since the universe operates according to certain patterns, humans flourish when they align with these patterns and suffer when they resist them. Later commentators developed these ideas in various directions. Zhuangzi, whose 3rd century commentary became standard, interpreted the Tao in highly abstract metaphysical terms. For Zhuangzi, the Tao is absolute non-being Wu, the ontological ground from which being emerges. His commentary emphasizes the paradoxical nature of the Tao. It is nothing yet makes everything possible. It does nothing yet nothing is left undone. Zhuangzi reads the Dao De Jing as a sophisticated metaphysical treatise about the relationship between being and non-being, presence and an absence. He Gong, another influential early commentator whose dates are uncertain, but who likely wrote before Zhuangzi, interpreted the Dao De Jing quite differently. His commentary emphasizes self-cultivation practices, breathing techniques, and methods for nourishing vitality. For He Gong, the Tao is not merely an abstract principle, but something that can be cultivated within one's own body. His reading connects the philosophical Tao to proto-religious practices aimed at health and longevity. These contrasting interpretations show the Tao's semantic richness. The term could support both abstract metaphysical speculation and concrete self-cultivation practice. This ambiguity or multivalence has enabled the concept to remain vital across very different contexts. It is crucial to distinguish the Taoist concept of Tao from various misconceptions that have become common, especially in popular Western appropriations. The Tao is not a personal God. It does not have consciousness, will, or personality. It does not answer prayers or punish wrongdoing. It is an impersonal principle or pattern, more like the laws of nature than a divine being, an energy or force. Despite frequent translations using terms like life force or cosmic energy, classical Taoist texts do not describe the Tao in these terms. Qi, a different concept does refer to something like vital energy, but the Dao and Qi are distinct. The Dao is not a substance, even a rarefied one, something that can be manipulated or directed. New Age appropriations often speak of aligning with the Dao in order to achieve personal goals, manifest desires, or gain power. But the classical Taoist understanding is that one aligns with the Dao by letting go of personal agendas, not by pursuing them more effectively, a vague synonym for spirituality. The Tao has specific philosophical meaning in its original context. Using Tao simply to mean spiritual truth or mystical wisdom strips away its precision and force. Understanding what the Tao actually meant to ancient Taoist thinkers requires attending to the specific philosophical and cultural context in which the concept developed. It was a response to competing philosophical schools, a challenge to prevailing assumptions about value and action, and an attempt to articulate a vision of reality that could ground a different way of living. The concept retains power today, not because it can mean anything we want it to mean, but because its specific meaning, a natural pattern that we can align with through non-forcing action, addresses problems that remain relevant. If the Tao is the most important concept in Taoism, Wu Wei is its most important practical principle. The term is usually translated as non-action, but this translation is deeply misleading. Wu Wei does not mean doing nothing. It does not advocate passivity or laziness. It does not suggest that we should never act or that all action is futile. Understanding what Wu Wei actually means and how it differs from common misinterpretations is essential to grasping Taoist philosophy. The term itself is grammatically straightforward. Wu means not or without. Wei means act or do or make. So Wu Wei literally means not acting or without action. But in Chinese philosophical usage, Wei has more specific connotations. It often implies artificial, forced or unnatural action, doing things that go against natural patterns or tendencies. So Wu Wei might be better translated as non-forcing and effortless action, action without strain, or spontaneous action. The Dao De Jing uses Wu Wei to describe both how the Dao operates and how the sage ruler should govern. Chapter 48 states, "In the pursuit of learning, one increases daily. In the pursuit of the Dao, one decreases daily, decreasing and decreasing again until one arrives at non-action. With non-action, nothing is not done." This passage establishes a paradox. Through not doing, everything gets done. How can this be? The key is understanding what kind of doing is being rejected. Conventional wisdom says that to achieve results, we must plan extensively, exert maximum effort, and forcefully impose our will on the world. The more we want something, the harder we should work for it. Success requires constant intervention, adjustment, and control. The Dao De Jing challenges this entire approach. Consider water, the Dao De Jing's favourite metaphor for Wu Wei. Water is soft and yielding. It flows around obstacles rather than confronting them directly. It seeks the lowest places, which people avoid. Yet over time, water wears away stone. It shapes the landscape. It nourishes all life. Water's power comes precisely from its yielding nature. This is Wu Wei in action, achieving results not through force but through aligning with natural tendencies. Or consider an example from agriculture, though this one is not explicitly in the Dao De Jing. A farmer who practices Wu Wei doesn't plant seeds and then do nothing. That would be laziness, not Wu Wei. But neither does the farmer try to force plants to grow faster by pulling on their shoots. A Mengzi parable famously illustrates this mistake. Instead, the Wu Wei farmer plants at the appropriate season, provides water and nutrients, removes competing weeds, and then allows the plants to grow according to their nature. The farmer acts, but the action aligns with natural processes rather than fighting them. In political terms, Wu Wei describes a style of governance that minimizes coercion and interference. Chapter 57 of the Dao De Jing presents this political philosophy explicitly. The more restrictions and prohibitions there are in the world, the poorer the people become. The more sharp weapons people have, the more troubled the state becomes. The more clever techniques there are, the more strange things occur. The more laws and ordinances are promulgated, the more thieves and robbers there are. Therefore the sage says, I do nothing, and the people transform themselves. I love stillness, and the people correct themselves. I do not interfere, and the people prosper themselves. I have no desires, and the people naturally become simple. This is radical political philosophy. It suggests that most government activity is counterproductive. Laws create lawbreakers by defining transgressions and suggesting methods of violation. Weapons create violence by making it possible and sometimes necessary. Regulations create corruption by creating opportunities to evade or manipulate rules. The more the government tries to control society, the more chaos it creates. The solution is wu-wei governance, establishing basic order and then stepping back, allowing people to live according to their own nature and interests rather than constantly directing them. Does this mean no government at all? Some anarchist interpreters of Daoism argue, yes, but the text seems to envision a minimalist government rather than no government. The sage ruler exists but makes his presence barely felt. The highest ruler is one whose existence people barely know. Next comes one whom they love and praise. Next comes one whom they fear. Next comes one whom they despise. When the ruler does not have enough trust, people will not trust him. Hesitant, he values his words. When his work is accomplished and affairs are successful, the people all say, it happened naturally by itself. This passage describes a hierarchy of rulership. The worst rulers are hated tyrants. Better are rulers who inspire fear. Better still are those who are loved. But the very best rulers are those whose role is so unobtrusive that people don't even recognize they're being governed. When things go well, people attribute success to their own efforts or to natural fortune, not realizing the ruler has created conditions that allow flourishing. This is the political ideal of wu-wei. Historical examples help illustrate how wu-wei was understood in practice. During the early Han dynasty, after the Qin Empire's collapse and the devastating civil wars that followed, China was exhausted. The first Han emperors, particularly Wen and Jing, adopted policies that later historians would characterize as Huanglao Daoism, a political philosophy combining legalist administrative techniques with Taoist restraint. These emperors reduced taxes, minimized military campaigns, avoided large construction projects, and generally left the population alone to recover. This period, known as the rule of Wen and Jing, is remembered as an era of peace and prosperity. The economy recovered. The population grew, the dynasty stabilized. Later Confucian historians sometimes criticize these emperors for insufficient Confucian virtue and ritual, but they had to admit the policies worked. This is wu-wei in political practice, not doing nothing but doing less, interfering minimally, allowing natural recovery rather than forcing rapid change. The emperors acted, but their action consisted largely of restraint, restraining their own ambitions, their bureaucracy's tendency to expand, their military's desire for conquest. In individual life, wu-wei similarly involves aligning oneself with natural patterns and tendencies, rather than forcing artificial behavior. The Zhuangzi, which develops Taoist ideas further, offers numerous stories illustrating this principle. In one famous story, a cook butchers an ox with such skill that his blade never dulls. He explains that he finds the natural spaces between joints and sinews rather than cutting through bone and tissue. His blade encounters no obstacles because he follows the ox's natural structure. This is wu-wei, perfect effectiveness through alignment with reality rather than force. Another story describes a swimmer who navigates a dangerous waterfall. Asked how he survives where others drown, he explains, "I go down with the water and come up with the water. I follow the way of the water and do not impose my selfishness on it." He doesn't fight the current or try to impose his will on the water. He recognizes the water's pattern and moves with it. This is Wu Wei. These examples show that Wu Wei is not passivity. The cook acts skillfully. The swimmer moves deliberately. The farmer tends crops. The sage ruler governs. But the action is different in quality from forced, strained, or unnatural action. It is responsive rather than imposing, adaptive rather than rigid, flowing rather than blocked. The psychological dimension of Wu Wei is equally important. Forced action comes from anxiety, from the sense that if we don't constantly intervene and control, disaster will follow. Wu Wei requires trust. Trust that natural processes have their own logic and effectiveness. Trust that the universe is not fundamentally hostile to our flourishing. This trust comes from observing nature. Plants grow without anxiety. Babies breathe without instruction. Hearts beat without conscious direction. Many things work perfectly well without deliberate control. The Taoist insight is that more things would work better if we stopped trying to forcefully control them. But this doesn't mean everything will be perfect if we just relax. The Taoist view is not utopian. Death, decay, and difficulty are natural too. Wu Wei doesn't eliminate suffering, but changes our relationship to it. Instead of constantly fighting against inevitable natural processes, we accept them and work within their parameters. This acceptance itself reduces suffering because much of our distress comes not from circumstances themselves, but from our resistance to them. Misunderstandings of Wu Wei are common, even in scholarly literature. Some presentations make it sound mystical, as if Wu Wei is a special state of consciousness or spiritual attainment. While there may be a meditative dimension to Wu Wei practice, the core concept is not mystical but practical. It is about the most effective way to act. Other presentations make it sound nihilistic, as if Taoists believe nothing matters and we might as well do nothing. But the text consistently emphasizes that Wu Wei is the way to accomplish things, not to accomplish nothing. The most problematic misunderstanding is when Wu Wei is appropriated for purely selfish ends. Modern self-help literature sometimes presents Wu Wei as a technique for achieving personal success without effort. Go with the flow and you'll get everything you want. This inverts the actual meaning. Wu Wei requires letting go of personal agendas and selfish desires, not pursuing them more cleverly. The whole point is to align with patterns larger than oneself, which often means accepting that one's personal preferences are not the center of the universe. Understanding Wu Wei properly requires recognizing its embeddedness in a larger philosophical vision. It makes sense only in the context of the Taoist understanding of the Tao as natural pattern, of water as model, of yielding as strength, of emptiness as useful, of lowness as safe. It is not a standalone technique, but part of a comprehensive alternative to conventional wisdom about how to live and govern. Grasping this principle transforms how we understand Taoism from an exotic mysticism into a sophisticated practical philosophy addressing perennial questions about action, effectiveness, and human flourishing. If Laozi is a shadowy figure whose historical existence is uncertain, Zhuangzi is slightly less mysterious, though only slightly. His personal name was Zhuangzhou, and he lived in the 4th century BCE, probably from around 369 to 286 BCE, making him a contemporary of Mencius, the great Confucian thinker. While we have little detailed information about his life, a few facts emerge from the historical record and from the text attributed to him. Zhuangzi served as a minor official in Meng, a small state located in what is now Henan province. This position would have given him some education and social status, but little wealth or power. He apparently lived in poverty, at least for part of his life. One story tells of him borrowing millet from a wealthy official, only to respond to an offered loan with sarcastic complaint about the official's stinginess. Another story describes him wearing patched clothing and rough hemp shoes, and another has him fishing in the Pooh River when emissaries from the King of Chu arrive to invite him to court. This last story, one of the most famous in the Zhuangzi, reveals much about his character and philosophy. The emissaries tell Zhuangzi that the king wants him to become chief minister, a position of tremendous power and responsibility. Without even looking up from his fishing, Zhuangzi responds by asking whether they have heard of a sacred turtle preserved by the King of Chu, dead for thousands of years, kept in a box and treasured. The emissaries confirm this. Zhuangzi asks, would the turtle rather be dead and treasured, or alive and dragging its tail in the mud? They respond that obviously it would rather be alive and muddy. Zhuangzi says, "Go away, I will drag my tail in the mud." This story encapsulates Zhuangzi's rejection of conventional ambition and success. The highest position the state can offer means nothing to him compared to freedom. He prefers poverty and insignificance to wealth and honour if the latter come with constraint. This is not mere personal preference but philosophical conviction. The Zhuangzi consistently advocates withdrawing from social ambition, rejecting official position, avoiding entanglement in political affairs. But Zhuangzi was not simply a hermit avoiding the world. He was an intellectual engaged in vigorous debate with other philosophical schools. The text records numerous discussions with his friend Huixie, a prominent logician of the school of names. These debates, which sometimes seem playful and sometimes serious, explore questions about language, knowledge, and reality. In one famous exchange, Zhuangzi and Huixie are standing on a bridge watching fish swim below. Zhuangzi remarks, "See how the fish swim about freely. This is the happiness of fish." Huixie objects, "You're not a fish. How do you know the happiness of fish?" Zhuangzi responds, "You're not me. How do you know I don't know the happiness of fish?" They continue this logical sparring, exploring the limits of knowledge and the possibility of knowing other beings' experiences. The Zhuangzi text itself is much longer than the Dao De Jing, consisting of 33 chapters that divide into 3 sections. The first 7 chapters, called the inner chapters, are generally considered authentic, that is, actually written by Zhuangzi or composed very close to his time. These chapters display a consistent philosophical voice and literary style. The next 15 chapters, the outer chapters, seem to be by various authors from the Zhuangist school, written perhaps within a century of Zhuangzi's death. The final 11 chapters, the miscellaneous chapters, are even more diverse, containing material from different periods and perspectives. Modern scholarship focuses primarily on the inner chapters as the most reliable source for Zhuangzi's own philosophy. The inner chapters show Zhuangzi developing ideas present in the Dao De Jing, but taking them in more radical directions. While the Dao De Jing addresses rulers and suggests how they might govern through Wu Wei, the Zhuangzi largely abandons any hope of influencing political affairs. While the Dao De Jing maintains some connection to conventional morality, the Zhuangzi challenges all moral distinctions. While the Dao De Jing is often poetic but relatively accessible, the Zhuangzi is wildly imaginative, using fantasy, humour, hyperbole, and paradox to shake readers out of conventional thinking. The Zhuangzi's opening story sets the tone. It describes the Peng, a mythical bird of enormous size, whose wings are like clouds across the sky. When the Peng flies, it rises 90,000 li high. Then the text imagines small birds laughing at this impossibility. Where does it think it's going? When I leap up, I don't rise more than a few feet before coming down to flit among the reeds. That's as good as flying gets. The small birds cannot conceive of the Peng's flight because their perspective is limited. This serves as a parable for human knowledge. We judge from our limited perspective and assume our small view captures reality. The text then moves to one of its most famous passages, Zhuangzi's dream of being a butterfly. Once Zhuangzi dreamed he was a butterfly flitting and fluttering around, happy with himself and doing as he pleased. He didn't know he was Zhuangzi. Suddenly he woke up, and there he was, solid and unmistakable Zhuangzi. But he didn't know if he was Zhuangzi who had dreamed he was a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming he was Zhuangzi. This story raises fundamental questions about identity, reality, and the trustworthiness of our experience. How do we know which state is the dream? Perhaps our waking life is the illusion. These provocative openings introduce themes that run throughout the inner chapters: the relativity of perspectives, the limitations of human knowledge, the artificiality of distinctions we take as natural, and the possibility of a more liberated mode of existence. Zhuangzi is fundamentally a skeptic, questioning our most basic assumptions. One of his main philosophical innovations is the critique of language and conceptual thinking. The Zhuangzi argues that language divides the seamless whole of reality into artificial categories. We create distinctions between right and wrong, good and bad, beautiful and ugly, then forget that these are human constructions rather than features of reality itself. We become trapped in these linguistic categories, arguing about which side of the distinction is correct, never recognizing that the distinction itself is the problem. The text uses the term qi-wu, equalizing things, or the equality of things, to describe seeing past these artificial distinctions to a more primordial unity. From the perspective of the Tao, there is no absolute difference between life and death, success and failure, beauty and ugliness. These are relative judgments made from limited perspectives. The sage learns to see past them. This doesn't mean the sage cannot distinguish between things, or cannot function in the world. The Zhuangzi is not advocating confusion or stupidity. Rather, the sage understands that distinctions are pragmatic and contextual rather than absolute. A thing is useful or useless only relative to particular purposes. From a different perspective, the valuation reverses. One famous parable describes a gnarled, twisted tree that is spared the axe because its wood is too worthless for lumber. The tree thus lives to a great age. What appears as uselessness from one perspective is survival from another. Zhuangzi extends this relativistic thinking to knowledge itself. How can we be confident in our judgments when we are making them from within limited perspectives? How do we know our cognitive faculties are reliable? The butterfly dream raises these questions. So do numerous other passages. The sage responds not by abandoning judgment altogether, but by holding judgments lightly, recognizing their provisional and perspectival nature. This philosophical skepticism leads to a distinctive ethics, or perhaps anti-ethics. Zhuangzi attacks Confucian morality not because he advocates immorality, but because he sees moral systems as themselves sources of suffering. Confucianism insists on filial piety, loyalty, righteousness, and ritual propriety. These seem like good values, but Zhuangzi argues that such moral codes create artificial constraints, force people into unnatural behaviors, and generate guilt and anxiety. Moreover, moral distinctions often reflect the interests of the powerful rather than objective truth. Stealing a hook gets you executed. Stealing a state makes you a duke, one passage notes sardonically, pointing to the hypocrisy of conventional morality. The Zhuangist alternative is not moral chaos, but a kind of naturalness that operates beyond moral rules. The sage acts appropriately not by following rules, but by responding spontaneously to circumstances from a place of deep harmony with the Tao. This is Wu Wei at the personal level, though Zhuangzi rarely uses that term. The sage's action is effortless, spontaneous, and appropriate, but it doesn't come from conscious moral reasoning. It flows from one's entire being aligned with natural patterns. The Zhuangzi expresses this through numerous parables about skilled craftsmen. The cook butchering the ox, the wheelwright cutting wheels, the swimmer navigating rapids, all demonstrate perfect skill that transcends conscious technique. When asked to explain their mastery, they cannot. They have moved beyond method to embodied wisdom. They don't follow rules. They perceive the grain of reality and move with it. This is the Zhuangist ideal, not learned moral virtue, but natural skillfulness. Another crucial theme is freedom, specifically freedom from the psychological constraints that cause suffering. Much of human misery comes from attachment to life and fear of death, desire for success and fear of failure, craving for praise and fear of criticism. The Zhuangzi argues that these are bondages created by taking conventional values too seriously. If we could see that life and death are just transformations within the Tao, that success and failure are relative judgments rather than absolute realities, that praise and blame reflect others' limited perspectives, we would be liberated from these anxieties. Several passages contemplate death explicitly. When Zhuangzi's wife dies, his friend Huixi visits to offer condolences and is shocked to find Zhuangzi singing and drumming on a bowl. Huixi rebukes him. "Your wife lived with you, raised your children, grew old with you, and now you sing at her death." Zhuangzi responds that at first he grieved, but then he reflected on the transformation involved. Before birth, there was no life. Before that, there was no body. Before that, there was no qi. These emerged from formlessness, and now they return to formlessness. It is like the progression of the seasons. To weep and wail seems to show a lack of understanding of destiny, so he stopped grieving. This is disturbing to conventional sensibility. Isn't this cold and inhuman? But Zhuangzi is not advocating callousness. He is suggesting that grief comes partly from seeing death as unnatural or wrong, when it is actually as natural as birth. Accepting this doesn't eliminate sensuousness, but transforms it into something less desperate and clinging. The Zhuangzi also contemplate physical deformity and disability. Several passages describe characters with severe deformities who nonetheless live contentedly, even serving as teachers. The point is that conventional judgments about what makes life worth living are arbitrary. We assume a healthy, beautiful, successful life is good and a deformed, poor, unsuccessful life is bad. But these judgments reflect social conventions, not deep truth. Someone who sees past these conventions can find contentment regardless of circumstances. This radical acceptance does not mean quietism or resignation. The Zhuangzi is not saying we should passively accept oppression or injustice. Rather, it offers psychological liberation that allows us to engage with the world without being psychologically destroyed by it. If we are not desperately attached to success, failure does not crush us. If we do not fear death, threats lose their power. If we do not crave honor, humiliation does not wound us. This creates a kind of invulnerability. The political implications are clear. Zhuangzi advocates withdrawal from political involvement not because politics is evil, but because it is dangerous and rarely effective. The state is violent, demanding and arbitrary. Officials serve at the whim of rulers who may turn on them at any moment. The Warring States period was full of examples of capable ministers who ended up executed, exiled or forced to suicide when they fell from favour. Zhuangzi sees this game as not worth playing. Better to live simply, avoid entanglement, preserve one's life and freedom. Some scholars interpret Zhuangzi as advocating a kind of primitivism, a return to a simpler, more natural way of life before civilization corrupted us. Certainly the text sometimes expresses nostalgia for an imagined ancient past when people lived simply without elaborate social structures. But Zhuangzi is sophisticated enough to know this past cannot be recovered. His primitivism is more rhetorical than literal. a way of critiquing present corruption by imagining an alternative. Zhuangzi's influence on later Daoism was immense. While the Dao De Jing provided the tradition's founding text, the Zhuangzi provided its most powerful philosophical articulation. Later Taoist thinkers would continue to grapple with Zhuangzi's questions about knowledge, language, death, and freedom. Taoist poets would adopt his imagery and perspective. Taoist religious practitioners would find in his text resources for contemplative practice. Even Confucian and Buddhist thinkers would engage with Zhuangzi, sometimes critically, sometimes appreciatively. The Zhuangzi also influenced Chinese artistic and literary traditions profoundly. The ideal of the scholar artist who withdraws from politics to pursue painting, poetry, and nature appreciation has Zhuangist roots. The aesthetic of naturalness, spontaneity, and unconventionality that marks much Chinese art reflects Zhuangist values. The figure of the eccentric genius who refuses to conform to social expectations owes much to Zhuangzi. Yet Zhuangzi's radicalism also limits his appeal. His skepticism and relativism can seem to undermine any basis for judgment or action. His acceptance of death can seem inhuman. His withdrawal from politics can seem irresponsible. These are real tensions in his thought. But they also represent Zhuangzi, pushing Taoist ideas to their limits, exploring what happens if you take the critique of conventional values seriously, all the way down. To understand Taoism fully, we must understand what it was opposing. The relationship between Taoism and Confucianism is one of the great dialectical tensions in Chinese intellectual history. These two schools offered competing visions of how to live and how to organize society, and their debate shaped Chinese civilization for millennia. While they sometimes influenced each other, and were not always as opposed as their advocates claimed, the fundamental differences were real and consequential. Confucius lived from 551 to 479 BCE, making him older than Laozi according to traditional chronology, though as we have seen, Laozi's dates are uncertain. Confucius was a teacher and philosopher who believed the chaos of his age could be resolved by returning to the values and institutions of the early Zhou dynasty. He idealized the Duke of Zhou, a statesman from 5 centuries earlier, and the ancient sage kings like Yao and Shun, whose reigns represented perfection in Confucian thought. The Confucian solution to disorder was moral cultivation, ritual propriety, and proper hierarchical relationships. Confucius taught that humans are naturally social beings who flourish only within well-ordered social structures. The key to good society is ensuring everyone understands their role and performs it virtuously. Rulers must be benevolent, ministers must be loyal, fathers must be loving, sons must be filial, husbands must be righteous, wives must be obedient, elder brothers must be gentle, younger brothers must be respectful. When everyone acts according to their position in this hierarchy, harmony results. Ritual or lie is central to Confucian thought. Ritual means the prescribed forms for social interaction, ceremonies, etiquette, protocol. Confucians believed ritual serves multiple functions. It expresses respect, maintains social order, cultivates virtue, and connects present generations to ancestors and tradition. Someone who has internalized proper ritual does not need to consciously think about how to behave. Correct action flows naturally from habituated virtue. This is the Confucian version of spontaneity, not the artless naturalness of the Taoist sage, but the effortless propriety of the gentleman. Confucian ethics emphasizes duty, hierarchy, and social roles over individual freedom. The self is not an autonomous individual, but a node in a network of relationships. One's identity comes from these relationships: son, brother, minister, friend. Acting virtuously means fulfilling the obligations these relationships entail. Personal desires are subordinated to social duty. This is not oppression from the Confucian perspective, but the path to genuine flourishing. Humans are fulfilled through participation in social life, not through withdrawal or radical individualism. The Taoist critique of Confucianism is comprehensive. The Zhuangzi contains numerous passages mocking Confucian scholars for their obsession with ritual, their moralistic judgments, and their naive faith in social reform. One story describes Confucius meeting a Taoist sage who rebukes him. "You promote your filial piety and brotherly love, working to ensure harmony between ruler and minister, to regulate the relations of husband and wife, and to establish good customs in learning. But these are all matters of managing human affairs. Have you not lost the constancy of your nature?" This passage encapsulates a fundamental Taoist objection. Confucian morality is artificial, imposing external standards on human nature rather than allowing natural tendencies to flourish. The elaborate system of duties and rituals creates a social straitjacket, forcing people into prescribed behaviors rather than letting them develop according to their own nature. Taoists also argued that Confucian morality is self-defeating. By insisting on filial piety as a virtue, Confucians turn a potentially natural feeling of affection for parents into a duty. But once love becomes duty, it ceases to be genuine. Similarly, by constantly teaching people about righteousness and honor, Confucians make people self-conscious about these concepts, which destroys their spontaneity. A genuinely righteous person does not think about righteousness, they simply act appropriately. All the Confucian instruction actually undermines the virtues it aims to create. The Dao De Jing states this explicitly. When the great Tao is abandoned, there is benevolence and righteousness. When cleverness emerges, there is great hypocrisy. When the family is in discord, there is filial piety. When the state is in chaos, there are loyal ministers. This suggests that Confucian virtues arise only when natural harmony has been lost. They are symptoms of sickness, not signs of health. In a healthy society, no one would need to teach filial piety because children would naturally care for parents. No one would need to emphasize loyalty because ministers would naturally serve well. The very existence of Confucian moral education proves society has gone wrong. Taoists further argued that Confucian morality creates the problems it claims to solve. By establishing clear standards of good and bad, right and wrong, Confucians create the possibility of their violation. Before someone tells you what righteousness is, you cannot be unrighteous. By naming virtues and vices, Confucians teach people both what to do and what not to do, inadvertently spreading knowledge of vice. A famous Taoist parable illustrates this. When a sage teaches people not to steal, those who had never thought of stealing learn that stealing is possible. On politics, the differences are even starker. Confucians believed in activist government led by a morally cultivated ruler assisted by virtuous ministers. The ruler's primary duty is moral example. If the ruler is virtuous, people will naturally respond by becoming virtuous themselves. This requires the ruler to constantly improve himself through study, reflection, and ritual practice. It also requires intervention in society, establishing schools, promoting the worthy, punishing the wicked, regulating commerce, conducting ceremonies. Good government is visible, active, present. Taoist political philosophy, especially in the Dao De Jing, advocates the opposite. The best government is invisible. The sage ruler rules through non-action, establishing basic conditions for flourishing and then stepping back. Excessive law creates criminals. Excessive regulation creates corruption. Excessive moralistic education creates hypocrisy. The Taoist ruler does not try to make people virtuous or wise, he simply prevents disorder and allows people to live according to their nature. Confucians found this Taoist vision irresponsible and nihilistic. Without moral education, won't people become beasts? Without ritual, won't society descend into chaos? Without virtuous leadership, won't the wicked dominate the good? The Confucian view is that human nature requires cultivation. Left to themselves, people will pursue selfish desires at others' expense. Social order depends on constraining these impulses through moral training and social norms. Taoists responded that Confucian cultivation is really indoctrination, imposing artificial values that create as much suffering as they prevent. Human nature is not inherently evil. When people act badly, it is often because social conditions have corrupted them. Poverty, oppression, competition for artificially scarce goods like status and honour. In a simple society with minimal government, people would live peacefully because they would have little reason for conflict. This debate about human nature runs deep. Confucians generally held that humans have potential for goodness, but require education and social structure to realize it. Without proper development, people might be neither good nor bad, but certainly would not become virtuous. Mencius, the most important Confucian after Confucius himself, argued that human nature is fundamentally good, but this goodness must be nurtured like a young plant that will die without care. Taoists had a more naturalistic view. Human nature is neither good nor bad in moral terms, it simply is. Trying to impose moral categories on nature is confused. A tiger is not evil for killing. A baby is not virtuous for crying when hungry. They are simply following their nature. Humans too have a nature, and flourishing comes from living according to it, not from suppressing it in favour of artificial social norms. The historical sources preserve numerous stories of encounters between Confucian and Taoist thinkers, though many are probably apocryphal. These stories show both schools using the same terms but with opposite meanings. Both value De, usually translated as virtue, but for Confucians De means cultivated moral virtue, while for Taoists it means natural power or integrity. Both discuss the Tao, but for Confucians the Tao is the moral path of the ancient sages, while for Taoists it is the natural pattern underlying all existence. In practical terms, these philosophical differences had real social consequences. Confucianism became the official ideology of the Chinese state from the Han Dynasty onward, shaping education, civil service examinations, family law, and social hierarchy. Its emphasis on filial piety, loyalty, and ritual profoundly influenced Chinese culture, but Taoism provided a psychological and cultural safety valve. When Confucian demands became too oppressive, when political life became too corrupt or dangerous, when the burden of social expectation grew too heavy, individuals could turn to Taoism for an alternative vision that validated withdrawal, simplicity, and naturalness. This created a characteristic Chinese cultural pattern: Confucian in public life, Taoist in private. An official might spend his career navigating court politics, maintaining proper ritual, advancing through bureaucratic ranks, but then retire to a country estate to write poetry, paint landscapes, and cultivate Taoist practices. Or an intellectual might withdraw from political life entirely, invoking Taoist principles to justify refusing office and living as a hermit. Chinese culture made space for both orientations, recognizing that neither alone captured the full complexity of human life, yet the tension was never fully resolved. Confucians continued to criticize Taoists for irresponsibility and selfishness, for abandoning social duty in favor of personal freedom. Taoists continued to criticize Confucians for oppressive moralism and naive faith in social reform. These mutual critiques sharpened both traditions, forcing each to develop more sophisticated arguments and to address the other's objections. Buddhism's arrival in China complicated matters further, adding a third major philosophical option. But that is another story. For understanding classical Taoism, the crucial context is the debate with Confucianism, because this debate shaped what Daoism emphasized and how it articulated its distinctive vision. Daoism developed not in isolation but in dialogue and opposition, defining itself partly by what it rejected in the dominant social philosophy of its time. The unification of China under the Qin dynasty in 221 BCE fundamentally changed the political landscape that had given rise to philosophical Daoism. For centuries, competing states had vied for dominance, and this competition created space for intellectual diversity. Rulers seeking advantage would patronize various philosophical schools, trying different approaches, but once the Qin conquered all rivals, this plurality was threatened. The first emperor Qin Shi Huang sought not just political unification but ideological uniformity. This posed an existential challenge to all philosophical schools, including Daoism. The Qin state had been influenced primarily by legalism, a harsh philosophy that emphasized strict laws, severe punishments, and absolute power concentrated in the ruler. The great legalist philosopher Han Feizi, who lived from about 280 to 233 BCE, synthesized legalist ideas with insights drawn from the Dao De Jing. Han Feizi saw the Dao De Jing as offering useful techniques for rulership, particularly the idea that the ruler should remain obscure and inscrutable while the state apparatus functions according to clear laws. This was a creative but selective appropriation. Han Feizi took Taoist concepts but deployed them toward goals of state power that the original text did not necessarily endorse. When the first emperor unified China, he faced massive administrative challenges. His solution involved ruthless centralization, abolishing the feudal system, standardizing weights and measures, imposing uniform currency, connecting regions with roads, and creating a bureaucracy directly answerable to the throne. He also sought ideological control. In 213 BCE, following advice from his chancellor Li Si, the emperor ordered the burning of books. The exact scope of this famous book burning is debated, but the sources agree that texts from various philosophical schools were targeted. The goal was to eliminate writings that might inspire dissent or encourage people to compare current policies unfavorably to ancient practices. Were Taoist texts burned? The sources are unclear. Some scholars argue that philosophical texts generally were targeted, suggesting Taoist works would have been included. Others note that the Dao De Jing's brief, enigmatic nature might have made it easy to preserve through memorization, and that its political philosophy of non-interference could be seen as less threatening than activist Confucian or Mohist ideologies. Regardless, the Qin period was inhospitable to independent philosophical thinking of any kind. Scholars who protested the book burning were reportedly executed or sent to forced labour, an incident known as the burial of scholars, though the details are disputed. The Qin dynasty lasted only 15 years. The first emperor's death in 210 BCE was followed by succession crisis, rebellion, and civil war. By 206 BCE, the dynasty had collapsed. The Han dynasty that emerged from this chaos initially pursued very different policies. The early Han emperors, having witnessed the Qin's spectacular failure, recognized that harsh legalist governance had provoked the rebellions that destroyed the regime. They needed an alternative approach. The solution was Huanglao Daoism, named after the legendary Yellow Emperor Zhuangzi and Laozi. This political philosophy combined legalist administrative techniques with Taoist restraint, creating a hybrid ideology that dominated early Han governance. The Yellow Emperor was reimagined as a Taoist sage ruler who governed through Wu Wei, and texts were circulated attributing Taoist teachings to him. This gave Taoism the weight of ancient authority while making it relevant to practical statecraft. Emperors Wen, 180-157 BCE, and Jing, 157-141 BCE, exemplified Huanglao governance. After decades of warfare, China needed recovery. These emperors reduced taxes, minimized military campaigns, avoided expensive construction projects, and generally practiced governmental restraint. They did not dismantle the bureaucracy the Qin had created. The administrative infrastructure was valuable, but they deployed it with a lighter touch. This period, the rule of Wen and Jing, is remembered as an era of peace and prosperity. The population grew, agriculture recovered, the economy strengthened, the dynasty stabilized. This success vindicated Taoist political philosophy, proving that Wu-Wei governance could work in practice. However, it is important to recognize that Huanglao Daoism was quite different from the philosophical Taoism of the Dao De Jing and Zhuangzi. The texts attributed to the Yellow Emperor and used in court discuss practical matters like agriculture, law, military strategy, and administration. While they use Taoist terminology like Dao and Wu-Wei, they are more concerned with effective technique than mystical transcendence. They represent Taoism adapted to the needs of empire, domesticated and made practical. This process of adaptation was inevitable. Once Taoism became an official ideology, even temporarily, it had to address questions that philosophical Taoism ignored or treated skeptically. How exactly should laws be structured? How should taxation work? How should military campaigns be conducted when necessary? How should ministers be selected and evaluated? Philosophical Taoism offered broad principles but little specific guidance. Huanglao texts filled these gaps, creating a governing philosophy that officials could actually apply. The status of Taoism shifted again under Emperor Wu, or 141-87 BCE. Emperor Wu was ambitious, expansionist, and interventionist in ways antithetical to Taoist restraint. He launched numerous military campaigns, extended Han power into Central Asia and Vietnam, undertook massive construction projects, and greatly expanded the bureaucracy. Such policies required ideological justification different from Huanglao's emphasis on restraint. Emperor Wu found it in Confucianism. In 136 BCE, Emperor Wu established the Imperial Academy, dedicated primarily to Confucian learning. He appointed Confucian scholars to important positions and began the process of making Confucianism the official state ideology. This did not happen overnight. It took several generations for Confucian dominance to solidify, but Emperor Wu's reign marked the turning point. The civil service examination system, which would eventually require mastery of Confucian classics, began to take shape. The interpretation of Confucian texts became a path to power. This shift marginalized Taoism politically, but did not eliminate it. Taoism survived by diversifying. Some Taoists withdrew into hermitage, rejecting any involvement with the state. Others pursued textual scholarship, producing commentaries on the Dao De Jing and Zhuangzi that kept these works alive intellectually. Still others began developing religious practices that would eventually transform Taoism from a philosophy into an organized religion with priesthood, rituals, and institutions. Archaeological discoveries have revealed the diversity of Taoist texts circulating during the early Han. The Mawangdui tomb contained not just the Dao De Jing, but also 4 texts collectively called the Huanglao manuscripts: the Jingfa, Canon of Law, the Shiliu Jing, 16 Canons, the Cheng Standards, and the Dao Yuan, Origins of the Dao. These texts show how Taoism was being adapted for political application, combining philosophical principles with practical governance advice. Another important discovery was the Guodian tomb's bamboo slips, which we discussed earlier. These show that multiple versions of Taoist texts were circulating simultaneously, suggesting a vibrant tradition of textual transmission and adaptation. The Guodian materials include not just Taoist works, but also Confucian texts, indicating that educated people of the Warring States period engaged with multiple philosophical traditions rather than identifying exclusively with one school. The question of schools itself requires caution. Modern scholarship recognizes that the division of ancient Chinese thought into distinct schools, Confucian, Taoist, legalist, Mohist, etc., is partly a later construction. The Han Dynasty scholar Liu Xiang systematically categorized philosophical texts into these schools in the 1st century BCE, creating the framework that subsequent generations used. But during the Warring States period, boundaries were more fluid. Thinkers drew on multiple traditions and ideas circulated across what would later be seen as distinct philosophical camps. Nevertheless, by the Han Dynasty, Daoism had emerged as a recognizable tradition with canonical texts, distinctive ideas, and identifiable social roles. The Dao De Jing and Zhuangzi were established as foundational works. The concepts of Dao, Wu-wei, and naturalness were associated specifically with this tradition, and the figure of the Taoist sage, whether hermit, advisor, or mystical practitioner, had become a cultural type. The early Han period was thus crucial for Daoism's development. It saw Daoism briefly elevated as an official ideology, then displaced by Confucianism but not limits. It saw Taoist ideas adapted for practical governance. It saw the beginnings of religious developments that would transform Taoism further. And it saw Taoist texts preserved and transmitted, ensuring that future generations would have access to the philosophical resources of the Warring States period. This pattern of Taoism adapting to changing political circumstances while maintaining its distinctive identity would characterize the tradition's survival through subsequent dynasties. Taoism would never again be an official state ideology, but it would find other niches, as a countercultural alternative to Confucian orthodoxy, as a resource for personal cultivation, as a religious system parallel to Buddhism, as an aesthetic sensibility informing art and literature. The Han period established the basic framework for this multifaceted survival. The transformation of Taoism from a philosophical school into an organized religion is one of the most significant developments in Chinese religious history. This process began in the late Han Dynasty, around the 2nd century CE, driven by social crisis, popular religiosity, and charismatic leadership. The result was the Celestial Masters movement, the first identifiable Taoist religious organization which established patterns of practice, belief, and institutional structure that would influence Chinese religion for centuries. The context was crisis. By the mid-2nd century CE, the Han Dynasty was in serious decline. Court politics were dominated by factionalism between eunuchs and aristocratic families. Emperors were often weak or young, unable to control their courts. Provincial governors became increasingly autonomous, acting more like warlords than imperial officials. Economic inequality grew as great estates expanded and small farmers lost their land. Natural disasters, floods, droughts, famines struck repeatedly. Epidemics spread, the population declined. People experienced these disasters as breakdown of cosmic order, signs that the dynasty was losing the mandate of heaven. In such circumstances, religious movements offering salvation, healing, and hope naturally emerged. One of the most important was founded by Zhang Daoling in Sichuan province around 42 CE. Zhang claimed to have received a revelation from Laozi, who had been deified as the embodiment of the Dao. According to the movement's later accounts, the deified Laozi appeared to Zhang Daoling on Mount Hemming and transmitted to him texts, rituals, and authority to establish a new dispensation that would replace the corrupted old order. The historicity of this revelation is impossible to verify, but its content reveals much about early religious Taoism. Zhang Daoling established a hierarchical organization with himself as celestial master and his successors in the role passing hereditarily through his family. The movement divided Sichuan into 24 administrative districts, each led by a libationer, who served both religious and administrative functions. In areas where the central government's authority had weakened, the celestial masters provided an alternative form of social organization. The movement's religious practices centered on moral transformation and healing. Members made public confessions of sins understood as transgressions against both moral norms and cosmic harmony. These sins were believed to cause illness, and confession was therapeutic. Rituals of purification and repentance restored individuals to proper alignment with the Tao. The celestial masters developed a system of registers, official documents recording one's spiritual rank and relationship with various gods and spirits. These registers were both religious identity documents and protective talismans. The theology of the celestial masters differed significantly from philosophical Daoism. While the philosophers spoke of the Tao as an impersonal principle or pattern, the celestial masters worshipped a personified deity, the Dao De Jing, or celestial worthy of the Tao and its power, identified with Laozi. This deity had existed since before creation and periodically incarnated to teach humanity. Laozi's historical incarnation was just one manifestation of this eternal divine being. The celestial masters thus combined philosophical concepts from the Dao De Jing with popular religious elements: gods, spirits, demons, heavens and hells, salvation and damnation. Another crucial innovation was the emphasis on sexual and dietary practices. The celestial masters taught methods of sexual cultivation supposed to enhance vitality and longevity. They prescribed dietary regimens avoiding grains, which were believed to harbour harmful spirits. They taught breathing exercises and meditation techniques for internal cultivation. These practices transformed the philosophical Taoist interest in nourishing life into systematic programs with specific techniques and goals. The movement was remarkably successful. At its height in the late 2nd century, the celestial masters controlled much of Sichuan and parts of neighbouring regions, creating a theocratic state within the nominal boundaries of the Han Empire. They collected taxes, administered justice, and maintained order. This was both impressive organisational achievement and potential threat to imperial authority. The movement's social dimensions are particularly interesting. Sources describe communal dining halls where travellers could eat freely, taking only what they needed and leaving food for others. This suggests an ethos of sharing and trust quite different from the competitive hierarchical society of Han China. There are also hints of gender egalitarianism unusual for the time. Women could serve as libationers and participate in rituals. The movement attracted people from various social classes, not just the elite. However, we must be cautious about sources. Much of what we know about early celestial masters comes from later Taoist texts and from critical accounts by Confucian and Buddhist observers. The latter often portrayed the movement as superstitious, deviant, and dangerous. Confucian historians, writing from the perspective of orthodox state ideology, had little sympathy for a religious movement that challenged government authority. Later Taoist texts, meanwhile, often idealized the early period, projecting their own concerns backward. The most objective evidence comes from archaeology. Tombs from the Han and post-Han periods have yielded amulets, talismans, and other objects associated with religious Taoism. These material artifacts confirm that the practices described in texts actually existed and were widespread. They also show that religious Taoism was diverse from early on, with local variations in practice and belief. The relationship between philosophical and religious Taoism has been debated endlessly. Some scholars argue they are fundamentally different traditions that happen to share a name. Philosophical Taoism was elite intellectual speculation. Religious Taoism was popular superstition. Others argue for continuity, noting that texts like the Dao De Jing were read as religious scriptures by the celestial masters, who saw their practices as fulfilling the philosophical text's teachings about aligning with the Tao. The truth is probably somewhere between, Religious Daoism drew on philosophical Daoism for texts, terminology, and some concepts, but it transformed these materials for different purposes. Where philosophers emphasize skepticism and naturalistic acceptance, religious practitioners promise supernatural powers and immortality. Where philosophers advocated withdrawal from social affairs, religious movements created communities and institutions. The continuity lies in shared texts and terminology. The discontinuity lies in how these were understood and applied. One key continuity deserves emphasis. Both philosophical and religious Taoism challenged orthodox Confucian culture. The philosophers did so through intellectual critique, questioning Confucian assumptions about morality, social hierarchy, and cultural refinement. The religious movements did so through social practice, creating alternative communities with different values, and sometimes providing space for people marginalized by mainstream society. This opposition to orthodoxy, whether intellectual or social, remained a constant thread through Taoism's history. The Celestial Masters movement would undergo numerous transformations in subsequent centuries. Zhang Daoling's descendants maintained leadership for several generations, but the movement fragmented and evolved. Other Taoist religious groups emerged, each with distinctive practices, texts, and organization. But the Celestial Masters established the basic template, revealed scriptures, hierarchical organization, ritual practices for healing and salvation, and the integration of philosophical concepts with popular religiosity. This religious transformation ensured Taoism's survival and spread. While philosophical texts might appeal only to educated elites, religious practices and promises of healing and salvation attracted broader populations. Taoism became a living tradition of practice, not just a collection of ancient texts. This vitality would prove crucial for Taoism's long-term influence on Chinese culture. In 184 CE, a massive peasant rebellion exploded across northern and central China, threatening to topple the Han dynasty. Led by a charismatic healer named Zhang Jue, who claimed divine authority and promised a new era of peace and prosperity, the rebels wore yellow shed scarves to identify themselves and were thus called the Yellow Turbans. While this rebellion is often described simply as a Taoist uprising, the reality is more complex. Nevertheless, the Yellow Turban Rebellion reveals important things about how Taoist ideas were circulating among common people and how they could be mobilized for political purposes. Zhang Jue was not connected to Zhang Daoling's Celestial Masters movement despite the shared surname. He emerged from eastern China rather than Sichuan, and his teachings and organization were distinct. Zhang Jue claimed to have received divine revelation from a deity called the Huang Lao Jun, Lord Huang Laojun, a title combining the Yellow Emperor and Laozi. This deity supposedly transmitted to Zhang Jue the Taiping Qingling Shu, the scripture of great peace and purity, a text that promised cosmic renewal and the arrival of an era of great peace, Taiping. The scripture of great peace, portions of which survive, combines Taoist philosophy with apocalyptic vision. It teaches that the current age is corrupt and doomed, but a new age of harmony and prosperity will soon begin. This millennial expectation gave followers hope and urgency. The text also contains medical knowledge, breathing exercises, talismanic magic, and moral teachings about social justice and care for the poor. Zhang Jue used these materials to create a religious movement that addressed people's practical needs while promising ultimate salvation. Zhang Jue's primary activity before the rebellion was healing. Late Han sources describe him as a wonder worker who cured diseases through prayer, ritual, and medicinal herbs. People brought their sick to him, and his successes brought followers. He organized these followers into a hierarchical structure with himself as supreme leader, assisted by his brothers Zhang Bao and Zhang Liang, and below them 36 officers commanding units of varying sizes. At its peak, the movement claimed hundreds of thousands of members across multiple provinces. The exact causes of the rebellion are debated. The traditional account says Jiang Jue planned a coordinated uprising for a specific date, but the plot was betrayed and he launched the rebellion prematurely. More recent scholarship suggests the movement was forced into rebellion by government attempts to suppress it, seeing its size and organization as threatening. Regardless, by spring of 184 CE, Yellow Turban armies were marching across northern China, attacking government offices, killing officials, and in some cases occupying entire counties. The rebellion's ideology mixed religious and social grievances. Zhang Jue proclaimed that the azure heaven of the Han dynasty was dead and the yellow heaven of the new age was at hand. Yellow was associated with Earth in five-phase cosmology, suggesting a return to fundamentals and perhaps invoking the authority of the legendary Yellow Emperor. The rebels attacked symbols of government authority, but also attacked wealthy landowners, suggesting class resentment alongside political opposition. The Han government's response was desperate. Initial military attempts failed. The Yellow Turbans were too numerous and too dispersed. The government had to mobilize provincial militias and grant extraordinary authority to commanders. It took years of campaigning to suppress the main rebellion, and even then pockets of resistance continued for decades. The final result was paradoxical. The government defeated the Yellow Turbans, but the military commanders empowered to do so became autonomous warlords whose rivalries eventually destroyed the dynasty. The rebellion's religious dimension is both fascinating and ambiguous. Yellow Turban sources are scarce. We rely mainly on hostile government records and later Taoist texts that may project later concerns backward. These sources portray Zhang Jue as using religious rhetoric to mobilize the masses, promising divine support and magical protection. Followers believed their righteousness made them invulnerable, that the gods fought on their side, that victory was cosmically ordained. When the rebellion failed and its leaders were killed, these beliefs were obviously disproven. Yet the movement's religious fervour is undeniable. People risked everything based on Zhang Jue's promises. They identified themselves with yellow headbands, making themselves visible to government forces. They attacked the powerful despite certain retaliation. This suggests genuine belief, not mere cynical manipulation by leaders. The relationship between the Yellow Turbans and philosophical Daoism is tenuous. The rebels invoked Laozi and used some Taoist terminology, but their millennialism, apocalypticism and violence have little in common with the Dao De Jing or Zhuangzi. If this is Daoism, it is Daoism so transformed by popular religiosity that the philosophical core is barely recognizable. This raises questions about what counts as Taoist. Is invoking Laozi sufficient, or must there be substantive philosophical continuity? Some scholars argue the Yellow Turban should not be classified as Taoist at all, but as a separate millennial movement that happened to appropriate some Taoist elements. Others argue that religious Taoism by this point was diverse enough to encompass apocalyptic movements alongside more conservative forms. The debate matters because it shapes how we understand Taoism's relationship to political violence and social upheaval. What is clear is that by the late Han, Taoist texts and ideas had spread beyond elite intellectual circles into popular culture, where they were adapted for purposes their original authors never imagined. The name of Laozi could inspire religious movements. The promise of great peace could motivate rebellion. Taoist cosmology could be used to explain social crisis and predict dynastic change. Taoism had become part of the cultural resources ordinary people drew on to make sense of their world and challenge oppressive conditions. The Yellow Turban Rebellion thus marks a watershed. After this point, Taoism unambiguously includes both philosophical texts studied by scholars and religious movements involving popular participation. The relationship between these forms remained complex and often contested, but neither could ignore the other. elite Taoist lineages had to distinguish themselves from popular movements they considered crude or deviant. Popular movements invoked elite texts to claim legitimacy and authority. This dialectic between elite and popular, philosophical and religious, would characterize Taoism throughout later Chinese history. The immediate consequence of the rebellion was increased government suspicion of religious organizations. Both Confucian officials and later imperial governments would be wary of large religious movements, seeing them as potential threats to order. This pushed Taoist religious organizations toward accommodation with state power when possible, and underground organization when necessary. It also encouraged the development of forms of Taoism less obviously threatening to authority, contemplative practices for individual cultivation, monastic institutions isolated from society, textual traditions confined to educated elites. Yet the rebellious potential never fully disappeared. Throughout Chinese history, subsequent rebellions would draw on religious Taoism for inspiration, legitimation, and organizational models. The pattern established by the Yellow Turbans, charismatic leader, healing practices, apocalyptic promises, millennialist ideology, yellow symbolism would recur. This made Taoism permanently ambiguous in official eyes, sometimes a respectable tradition of learning and culture, sometimes a dangerous source of heterodoxy and rebellion. The fall of the Han Dynasty in 220 CE plunged China into centuries of disunity known as the Six Dynasties period, lasting until reunification under the Sui dynasty in 589 CE. This era of political fragmentation, warfare, and population displacement was traumatic for Chinese civilization. Yet it was also a period of remarkable cultural creativity, and for Taoism it proved crucial. Cut off from centralized patronage and forced to adapt to diverse regional circumstances, Taoism proliferated into multiple forms, developed new practices and institutions, and engaged in productive exchange with the newly arrived Buddhism. The Taoism that emerged from this period was far more complex and diverse than what existed before. The political landscape was chaotic. China split into competing kingdoms, which further fragmented and reformed in shifting alliances. The north was repeatedly invaded by nomadic peoples who established their own dynasties, while Chinese aristocratic families fled south, establishing capitals along the Yangtze River. These barbarian invasions, as Chinese sources called them, traumatized the northern elite and challenged assumptions about Chinese cultural superiority. Warfare was constant. Dynasties rose and fell with bewildering rapidity. No one could predict which regime would survive and which would be destroyed. In this instability, Taoism offered several things that people needed. First, it provided explanation. Taoist cosmology interpreted dynastic cycles as natural transformations governed by cosmic patterns. The rise and fall of dynasties reflected changes in celestial influences and the accumulation and dissipation of dynasties' virtuous power. This made the chaos comprehensible rather than merely random and terrifying. Second, Taoism offered practices for personal survival. In dangerous times, people sought health, longevity, and protection. Taoist techniques promised these benefits. Third, Taoism provided alternatives to government service. For aristocrats who might once have sought careers in administration, the collapse of stable government made such careers impossible or dangerous. Taoist cultivation offered a prestigious alternative pursuit. Two major Taoist movements emerged during this period, the Shangqing highest clarity and Lingbao numinous treasure traditions. Both developed in southern China among aristocratic families, but they had distinctive characteristics. The Shangqing tradition began in the 360s CE with a series of revelations received by Yangshi, a medium who channeled messages from immortals dwelling in the Shangqing heaven. These immortals transmitted texts, described celestial realms, and taught meditation techniques. The revelations were received in the household of Zhu Mi, a southern aristocrat, and preserved by his family. The Shangqing texts are elaborate and poetic, describing journeys through multiple heavens populated by gods, goddesses, and perfected beings. They prescribe visualization meditations where practitioners imagine deities residing in various parts of their bodies, establishing microcosmic correspondence between human body and cosmic hierarchy. Shangqing Daoism appealed to educated elites because it required literacy, aesthetic refinement, and leisure for extended contemplation. It was not a popular religion requiring temples and priests, but an elite practice pursued in private. Aristocrats withdrew to mountain retreats to perform Shangqing meditations, seeking visions of celestial realms and transformation into immortals. This privatization made Shangqing Daoism politically safe. It posed no threat to authorities because it made no claims on public space or power. The Lingbao tradition emerged slightly later, in the early 5th century, and had different characteristics. Lingbao texts claimed even more exalted origin than Shangqing, dating themselves to the beginning of the cosmos. They described elaborate rituals of cosmic renewal, where Taoist priests performed ceremonies linking human community to celestial powers. Unlike the individualistic Shangqing meditations, Lingbao rituals were communal events serving social functions like funerals, festivals, and community protection. Lingbao also absorbed substantial Buddhist influence, adapting concepts like rebirth, karma, and universal salvation. This made Lingbao more accessible than Shangqing. One didn't need to be an educated aristocrat performing elite meditations. One could participate in community rituals conducted by priests. Both traditions developed elaborate pantheons of gods, goddesses, immortals, and celestial bureaucracies. These divine hierarchies mirrored earthly governmental structures, with the cosmos organized into departments, ranks, and jurisdictions. This bureaucratization of heaven reflected the Chinese cultural assumption that the cosmos should be orderly and hierarchical like properly governed human society. It also provided a cognitive map, allowing practitioners to navigate spiritual realms. The formation of a Taoist canon was another crucial development of this period. Buddhist examples stimulated this. Buddhism arrived in China during the Han Dynasty, but became influential during the Six Dynasties period, partly because Buddhist monasticism offered meaning and community amid political chaos. Buddhism had an enormous canon of scriptures translated from Indian languages, giving it textual authority and coherence. Taoist leaders recognized they needed similar canonical collections to compete. Early efforts at canon formation involved collecting and organizing texts. The process was not centrally coordinated but occurred in multiple lineages. By the early 6th century, Taoist collections included philosophical classics like the Dao De Jing and Zhuangzi, revelatory texts from Shangqing and Lingbao, ritual manuals, hagiographies of immortals, meditation techniques, alchemical recipes, and much else. These collections were called the Daozang, the Taoist canon. Later dynasties would expand and reorganize the canon, but the Six Dynasties established the basic principle of authoritative collected scriptures. Another important development was the emergence of distinct Taoist social roles. The hermit sage, present since ancient times, continued as an ideal, but now there were also Taoist priests who performed rituals for communities, Taoist adepts who pursued esoteric practices in monasteries or mountain retreats, Taoist scholars who studied and commented on texts, and Taoist masters who transmitted teachings to disciples. These roles sometimes overlapped. One person might be both hermit and scholar, both priest and adept, but the specialization marked increasing institutional complexity. The interaction between Taoism and Buddhism during this period was intense and productive, though often competitive. Buddhism posed a serious challenge to Taoism. It offered sophisticated philosophy, impressive institutional organization, powerful ritual technology and the prestige of foreign origin. Buddhism claimed universal truth transcending particular cultures, while Daoism was rooted in specifically Chinese cultural patterns. Buddhism had a founder, the historical Buddha, whose life story provided a clear model for followers. Daoism's origins were obscure, its founding figures uncertain or legendary. Daoists responded to this challenge in several ways. Some engaged in polemical attacks, claiming Buddhism was inferior to Daoism, or that the Buddha was actually a disciple of Laozi who went west to teach barbarians. The conversion of the barbarians legend became a standard Daoist claim. Laozi, after leaving China through the western border pass, travelled to India, where he became the Buddha's teacher. This narrative made Buddhism derivative of Daoism and explained why Buddhism existed. It was Daoism adapted for inferior foreign peoples. Buddhist monks naturally rejected this account, leading to centuries of debate. Other Daoists responded by learning from Buddhism. They adapted Buddhist meditation techniques, borrowed Buddhist organizational forms like monasticism, incorporated Buddhist concepts like karma and rebirth, and even adopted Buddhist literary styles and rhetorical strategies. This Buddhist influence transformed Daoism substantially. The Lingbao scriptures, for instance, are full of Buddhist terminology and concepts thoroughly integrated into Taoist cosmology. This synthesis created new forms of Taoism that bore only partial resemblance to the philosophical Taoism of the Warring States period. Still other Taoists pursued integration, arguing that Buddhism and Taoism were fundamentally compatible. Both taught transcendence of worldly attachments, both offered paths to liberation from suffering, both emphasized compassion and non-violence. The differences were matters of emphasis and method, not fundamental contradiction. This integrationist tendency would grow stronger in later periods, culminating in the common Chinese saying that the three teachings are one, meaning Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism all teach the same ultimate truth in different words. The geographical dimension of 6 dynasties Taoism deserves emphasis. With China divided between north and south, Taoist traditions developed differently in each region. Southern Taoism, represented by Shangqing and Lingbao, was influenced by the aristocratic émigré culture that dominated the southern courts. It emphasized textual sophistication, aesthetic refinement, and individual spiritual cultivation. Northern Taoism, meanwhile, developed under non-Chinese regimes that patronized Buddhism more than Taoism. Northern Taoists had to compete harder for patronage and resources, which may have pushed them toward more dramatic public demonstrations of power, miracle working, alchemy, and showmanship. The Celestial Masters movement, founded in Sichuan, survived this period by adapting to changed circumstances. The movement's early theocratic character became impossible to maintain as stable government returned to Sichuan. The Celestial Masters evolved into a more conventional religious organization, maintaining hereditary leadership through the Jiang family, but integrating into the mainstream of Chinese religious life. They developed liturgical services, temple rituals, and ethical teachings that could coexist with government authority rather than challenge it. This accommodation ensured survival, but required compromise of the movement's original radical vision. Women's roles in 6 dynasties Taoism warrant attention. Sources suggest that women could pursue Taoist cultivation, receive revelations, and achieve high spiritual status. Several of the immortals featured in Shangqing revelations were female, providing models for women practitioners. Aristocratic women sometimes became Taoist adepts, pursuing meditation and alchemical practices. This did not mean gender equality. Chinese society remained patriarchal, but Taoism provided some space for women's religious agency that Confucianism, with its strict gender hierarchies, did not. The hagiographical literature of this period created models of Taoist achievement. Collections of immortals' biographies describe individuals who attained transcendence through various means: alchemical transformation, meditative realization, moral perfection, divine favor, or simple longevity through proper life cultivation. These stories served multiple functions. They provided inspiration and instruction for aspirants. They legitimated Taoist practices by demonstrating their effectiveness. They entertained readers with fantastic tales of magical powers and celestial adventures, and they preserved cultural memory of notable Taoists, creating a sense of lineage and tradition. The concept of immortality itself underwent development during this period. Earlier notions of immortality were relatively simple: not dying, living indefinitely in physical form. By the Six Dynasties, Taoist thinkers distinguished multiple types of immortality. The highest was transcendent immortality, where one's entire being transformed into pure energy and ascended to celestial realms. Lower was earthbound immortality, where one achieved extreme longevity but remained in the physical world. Lower still was corpse liberation, where one appeared to die but actually shed the mortal body like a husk, while the true self escaped. These distinctions created a hierarchy of achievement that sophisticated practitioners could debate and theorize about. Alchemy became increasingly important during this period, both in external and internal forms. External alchemy, Weiden, involved creating elixirs from minerals and metals, particularly cinnabar, mercury sulfide, which when ingested were believed to confer immortality. This pursuit was dangerous. Mercury compounds are toxic, and numerous Taoists died from alchemical poisoning. Yet the practice persisted because occasional positive effects from small doses acting as stimulants seemed to confirm the theory. Internal alchemy, Neiden, which treated the body itself as an alchemical laboratory and used meditation and breath control to transform internal energies, developed as a safer alternative. The language and symbolism of external alchemy, furnaces, ingredients, processes, transformations, was internalized and applied to bodily cultivation. The relationship between philosophical and religious Taoism during the Six Dynasties remained complex. Educated elites continued to study the Dao De Jing and Zhuangzi as philosophical texts, writing commentaries that explored their meaning through sophisticated analysis. The most influential commentary was Wang Bi's 3rd century interpretation of the Dao De Jing, which read the text as metaphysics about being and non-being. Wang Bi's commentary became canonical, shaping how educated Chinese understood the text for centuries. His philosophical approach largely ignored the religious dimensions developing in Shangqing and Lingbao circles. Yet even philosophical Taoism was changing. The Xuanshui, or mysterious learning movement of the 3rd and 4th centuries, combined Taoist texts with the Confucian Book of Changes, creating a neo-Taoist philosophy that addressed issues of substance and function, being, non-being, name, and actuality. Thinkers like Wang Bi, Guo Xiang, who wrote the standard Zhuangzi commentary, and Xiang Xiu explored how the ineffable Tao relates to the manifest world, how sages can be both worldly and transcendent, and how spontaneity relates to social norms. This philosophical sophistication kept Taoism intellectually respectable, even as popular religious Taoism developed in very different directions. The Six Dynasties period thus took the relatively unified philosophical Taoism of the classical period and exploded it into multiple forms: elite contemplative practice, popular communal ritual, philosophical speculation, alchemical experimentation, hagiographical literature, canonical scripture, monastic discipline, and priestly profession. This diversification created tensions and contradictions within the tradition. Different lineages sometimes barely recognized each other as authentically Taoist, yet this very diversity ensured survival. When one form of Daoism faced suppression or indifference, others continued. The tradition was too multifaceted to be easily eliminated or controlled. By the end of the Six Dynasties period, when China reunified under the Sui dynasty in 589, Daoism had been transformed from a philosophical school into a comprehensive religious tradition, with texts, practices, institutions, and social roles comparable to Buddhism. It had established its place in Chinese religious life, a position it would maintain through subsequent dynasties despite ongoing competition with Buddhism and Confucianism. The fragmentation and creativity of the Six Dynasties had produced a Daoism robust enough to survive whatever challenges came next. The Tang Dynasty, 618-907 CE, represents a golden age for Daoism. The ruling Li family claimed descent from Laozi, whose surname was traditionally given as Li, and used this supposed ancestry to legitimize their rule and justify patronage of Daoism. The Tang emperors, particularly in the dynasty's first century, supported Taoist institutions generously, sponsored compilation of Taoist texts, granted Taoists privileges and honours, and sometimes even participated in Taoist rituals themselves. This imperial patronage brought Taoism unprecedented prestige and resources, though it also brought new challenges and compromises. The Tang dynasty's founder, Li Yuan, and his son Li Shimin, Emperor Taizong r. 626-649, established the pattern of Taoist patronage. They claimed that the deified Laozi had appeared to one of their ancestors to grant him power and authority. This divine mandate, they argued, proved their right to rule. The claim was transparently political. No serious person believed the Li family actually descended from a semi-legendary 6th century BCE figure, but it served its purpose. It connected the new dynasty to ancient authority and provided ideological justification for their rule. Imperial patronage took concrete forms. The emperors built Taoist temples throughout the realm, converting some Buddhist temples to Taoist use and constructing new ones. They granted tax exemptions to Taoist institutions. They established a system of Taoist clergy with official ranks and titles, creating a religious bureaucracy parallel to the civil service. They commanded compilation of the Taoist canon, organizing texts that had accumulated over centuries into systematic collections. And they occasionally issued edicts granting Taoism precedence over Buddhism in ceremonial matters, though these edicts were not consistently enforced and often provoked Buddhist protest. The most famous Taoist figure of the early Tang was Sima Chengzhen, 647-735, a master of the Shangqing lineage. Sima served several emperors as advisor and spiritual guide. He lived primarily at Mount Tiantai, where he cultivated Taoist practices and taught disciples, but made periodic visits to court. His writings on meditation, cosmology, and self-cultivation influenced Taoist thought profoundly. Sima exemplified the ideal Tang Taoist: learned, refined, politically astute, spiritually accomplished, and comfortable moving between mountain retreat and imperial court. Emperor Xuanzong, around 712-756, who reigned during the Tang's height, was particularly devoted to Taoism. He instituted examinations on Taoist texts for aspiring officials, similar to the Confucian civil service examinations. He wrote commentaries on the Dao De Jing. He sponsored public lectures on Taoist scriptures. He built an elaborate Taoist temple in the capital, Chang'an, and participated in rituals there. His patronage brought Taoism to the center of elite culture in ways unprecedented since the early Han. However, Xuanzong's reign also shows the dangers of political involvement. The emperor's infatuation with his concubine Yang Guifei and his neglect of governance contributed to the Anlushan Rebellion, 755-763, a devastating civil war that nearly destroyed the dynasty. Taoist advisors at court failed to prevent this disaster and lost credibility as a result. The rebellion marked a turning point. After it, Tang emperors were more cautious about Taoist influence, and Taoism's political prominence gradually declined. The relationship with Buddhism during the Tang remained competitive. Buddhism had also flourished under early Tang patronage, and the two traditions vied for imperial favour and resources. Buddhist monasteries often had more wealth and influence than Taoist institutions. Buddhist philosophy, particularly the sophisticated systems of Tiantai and Huayan, impressed educated elites. Buddhist art and architecture dominated the visual landscape of Tang cities. Taoists struggled to compete with this Buddhist success. The competition sometimes became hostile. Taoist polemicists continued arguing that Buddhism was foreign superstition inferior to native Taoism. Buddhist polemicists countered that Taoism was crude magic unworthy of serious people. Occasionally emperors intervened, ordering debates between Taoist and Buddhist representatives at court. The debates followed formal protocols, with each side presenting arguments and trying to demolish the other's position. The emperor would then declare a winner, which determined patronage and privilege. These debates were as much political theatre as philosophical inquiry, but they kept both traditions intellectually sharp. Despite competition, Tang Taoism and Buddhism also influenced each other. Taoist meditation techniques borrowed from Buddhist dhyana practices. Taoist monasticism adopted elements of Buddhist monastic discipline. Taoist scriptures incorporated Buddhist literary forms and terminology. This mutual influence created hybrid forms that were neither purely Taoist nor purely Buddhist, but syncretic combinations. At the popular level, many Chinese saw little contradiction in participating in both Taoist and Buddhist rituals, consulting both Taoist and Buddhist priests for different needs. Tang Taoism also had a significant cultural impact beyond explicitly religious contexts. Taoist themes saturated Tang poetry, the dynasty's most celebrated cultural achievement. Poets like Li Bai (701–762), Wang Wei (699–759), and Du Fu (712–770) all engaged with Taoist ideas and imagery. Li Bai, one of China's greatest poets, was associated with Taoist circles and incorporated Taoist themes of wine, nature, freedom, and transcendence throughout his work. His poetry celebrates spontaneity, criticizes social constraints, and expresses longing for mystical transformation, all Taoist motifs. Tang's landscape painting similarly shows Taoist influence. The characteristic Chinese landscape painting style emerged during this period, depicting vast natural vistas with tiny human figures dwarfed by mountains, rivers and forests. This aesthetic expresses the Taoist sense of nature's grandeur and humanity's modest place within it. Painters often inscribe Taoist poetry on their works, making the connection explicit. The practice of scholar artists retreating to mountains to paint, itself a Taoist-influenced lifestyle choice, became an ideal that would shape Chinese artistic culture for centuries. Taoist mountain culture flourished during the Tang. Certain mountains were designated sacred Taoist sites, attracting pilgrims, practitioners and literati. Mount Wudang, Mount Qingcheng, Mount Longhu, and others became centres of Taoist activity, with temples, monasteries and hermitages scattered across their slopes. The mountains were seen as spiritually potent places where the boundary between mundane and transcendent thinned, where immortals might be encountered, where cultivation was more effective than in lowland cities. This sacralization of landscape gave Taoism a geographical dimension, anchoring abstract philosophy in specific physical locations that people could visit. The Tang also saw continued development of Taoist ritual. Taoist priests performed elaborate ceremonies for various purposes: cosmic renewal, protection from disaster, healing, exorcism, funerals, and celebrations of sacred days. These rituals incorporated music, dance, recitation, offerings, and visualization practices. They required extensive training and mastery of complex liturgies. The priesthood became increasingly professionalized, with formal ordination procedures, hierarchical ranks, and specialized training. This professionalization made Daoism more institutionally robust, but also more bureaucratic and less spontaneous. Women's participation in Tang Daoism is documented but limited. Some women became Taoist nuns, living in convents and pursuing cultivation practices. A few achieved recognition as adepts or teachers, but Taoist institutions remained male-dominated, and women's opportunities for advancement were constrained by broader social restrictions on female autonomy. Nevertheless, Taoist convents provided one of the few institutional spaces where women could live independently of family control and pursue intellectual and spiritual development. The Tang period also witnessed developments in Taoist alchemy. External alchemy, despite its dangers, continued to attract practitioners. Tang alchemists experimented with various mineral and metallic compounds, seeking the perfect elixir of immortality. Some of these experiments contributed to developments in Chinese chemistry and medicine as alchemists discovered new substances and reactions, but many practitioners died from ingesting toxic compounds, and by the late Tang, external alchemy was becoming discredited in favor of safer internal practices. Internal alchemy underwent systematic development during the Tang. Practitioners mapped correspondences between external alchemical processes and internal bodily transformations. The body became a microcosmic laboratory where yin and yang energies could be refined and recombined to create an immortal embryo within oneself. This internal embryo would gestate through meditation and breath control, eventually emerging as an immortal spiritual body. These practices required years of disciplined effort under expert guidance, making them more suitable for monastic contexts than lay practice. The persecution of 845 CE marked a crisis for both Buddhism and Taoism. Emperor Wuzong, influenced by Taoist advisors, ordered the destruction of Buddhist monasteries and temples, the forcible return of monks and nuns to lay life, and the confiscation of Buddhist wealth. This was the most severe of several anti-Buddhist persecutions during Chinese history. While Taoism initially benefited from this attack on its competitor, the emperor's death soon after reversed the policy, and his successor restored Buddhism. Moreover, the precedent of imperial persecution alarmed Taoists, showing that state support could be withdrawn as easily as granted. Both traditions learned the danger of depending too heavily on imperial patronage. The late Tang saw Taoism's political influence decline. The dynasty itself was weakening, plagued by eunuch power, warlordism, and peasant rebellions. Court patronage of Taoism decreased. The cultural creativity of the early Tang faded, yet Taoist institutions survived, and many of the developments of the Tang period — systematic canonical collections, professionalized priesthood, mountain sacred sites, integration with elite culture — would shape Taoism through subsequent dynasties. The Tang experience taught Taoism both the benefits and risks of political engagement. Imperial patronage brought resources and prestige, but also dependence and vulnerability. Close association with the state meant sharing its fortunes, rising with its success and falling with its failure. This lesson would influence Taoist strategies in later periods, as different lineages chose various positions along the spectrum from close political involvement to deliberate isolation. The Song dynasty, 960–1279, represents a period of both challenge and innovation for Taoism. The Song emperors were less consistently supportive of Taoism than the Tang, and the rise of Neo-Confucianism as a revitalized philosophical system created serious intellectual competition. Yet the Song also saw remarkable Taoist developments in internal alchemy, medicine, and what we might call proto-scientific investigation. Taoists contributed significantly to technological innovation, pharmacology, and naturalistic observation. During this period, even as their political influence waned, The Song dynasty came to power after a period of disunion called the Five Dynasties and Ten Kingdoms period. The Song founders sought to create a stable, centralized state governed by a professional bureaucracy selected through Confucian examinations. This Confucian emphasis reduced opportunities for Taoists at court compared to the Tang. Nevertheless, several Song emperors patronized Daoism, particularly the Shenxiao Divine Empyrean and Qingwei Pure Subtlety traditions, which emphasized ritual magic and healing. Emperor Huizong, or 1126, was the most significant Song patron of Taoism. He claimed to receive revelations from Taoist deities, established himself as a Taoist hierarch, and granted lavish support to Taoist institutions. He commissioned a new edition of the Taoist canon, compiled in 1116 to 1117, which contained over 5,000 scrolls. This Taoist canon, though later lost, represented the most comprehensive collection yet attempted. Huizong also elevated Taoist clergy to high ranks and integrated Taoist ritual into state ceremonies. However, Huizong's reign ended in catastrophe. The Song faced invasion from the Jurchen Jin dynasty in the north. In 1127, the Jin captured the capital Kaifeng, took Huizong and his son captive, and occupied all of northern China. This forced the Song to retreat south and establish a new capital at Hangzhou, beginning the Southern Song period, 1127 to 1279. This military disaster discredited Huizong's policies, including his Taoist patronage. His successor and later Song emperors were more cautious about supporting Taoism. The intellectual challenge came from Neo-Confucianism, a revitalized form of Confucian philosophy developed by thinkers like Cheng Yi, Cheng Hao, and especially Zhu Xi, 1130 to 1200. Neo-Confucians created sophisticated philosophical systems that incorporated metaphysical speculation while maintaining Confucian ethical commitments. They borrowed some concepts from Buddhism and Taoism, particularly ideas about cosmic patterns and self-cultivation, but deployed them toward Confucian ends. Neo-Confucianism offered educated elites a comprehensive worldview that satisfied intellectual curiosity while supporting social hierarchy and moral orthodoxy. Zhu Xi's philosophy became particularly influential. He synthesized earlier Neo-Confucian thought into a coherent system centered on Lai principle and Qi material force. Everything in the universe, Zhu Xi argued, consists of Li, the rational pattern or principle, and Qi, the material energy that embodies it. Humans have the same fundamental nature as all things, but moral cultivation requires learning to distinguish the lie of one's essential nature from the Qi of selfish desires. This cultivation involves both study, to understand principles intellectually, and practice, to embody them behaviorally. Neo-Confucianism challenged Taoism on multiple fronts. It provided sophisticated metaphysics comparable to Buddhist and Taoist systems, removing one of Confucianism's perceived weaknesses. It emphasized active moral engagement rather than withdrawal, making Taoist reclusion seem selfish. It validated scientific investigation of natural patterns as discovery of Li, but within a framework emphasizing social duty rather than personal transcendence. And crucially, it dominated education and examinations, ensuring that ambitious young men spent years studying Neo-Confucian texts rather than Taoist or Buddhist scriptures. Taoists responded to this challenge by developing their own sophisticated philosophical systems, particularly in internal alchemy. The Southern Song period saw the full flowering of Neiden, internal alchemy, as both practice and theoretical framework. Masters like Zhang Boduan (987 to 982), whose work Understanding Reality, Wuzhen Pian, became foundational, systematized internal alchemical theory. Zhang and his successors described the body as containing channels, centers, and energies that could be transformed through meditation, breath control, and visualization. Internal alchemy used the metaphors of external alchemy, furnace, cauldron, ingredients, fire, processes, but applied them to bodily transformation. The practitioner's lower abdomen became the cauldron, breath control provided the fire, and various internal energies served as ingredients. Through proper practice, these could be refined into progressively purer forms, eventually producing an immortal embryo that would mature into a spiritual body capable of surviving physical death. This was technical, demanding practice requiring years of training under expert guidance. The theoretical sophistication of Nidan matched no Confucian metaphysics. Taoist alchemists developed detailed cosmologies mapping correspondences between macrocosm and microcosm, between celestial patterns and bodily processes. They analyzed time cycles, directional correlations, numerical symbolism, and textual hermeneutics with intellectual rigor comparable to any tradition. This philosophical dimension elevated internal alchemy beyond mere technique to a comprehensive system of knowledge. Taoist medicine also advanced significantly during the Song. The great physician and alchemist Sun Simiao, 581–682, active at the Sui-Tang transition, had established precedents for integrating Taoist cultivation with medical practice. Song Taoists continued this integration, contributing to pharmacology, diagnostic techniques, and therapeutic methods. The Song period saw publication of numerous medical texts that incorporated Taoist theories of qi, yin-yang dynamics, and five-phase correspondence. One significant contribution was the emphasis on preventive medicine and health cultivation. Rather than merely treating disease after it appeared, Taoist physicians advocated lifestyle practices that maintained health, proper diet, breathing exercises, moderate activity, stress reduction, and seasonal adjustment of behaviors. This holistic approach influenced Chinese medical culture broadly, though it was not exclusively Taoist. Confucian and Buddhist physicians shared similar commitments to preventive care. Taoist involvement in what we would call scientific and technological investigation is particularly interesting. Song Taoists experimented extensively with minerals, metals, and chemical compounds. While seeking alchemical transformation, they discovered various reactions and substances. Some historians argue that Taoist alchemists' experiments contributed to the invention of gunpowder, though the evidence is ambiguous. What is clear is that alchemical experimentation required careful observation, record-keeping, and procedural precision, methods fundamental to empirical investigation. Similarly, Taoist interest in astronomy and astrology promoted observational astronomy. Determining auspicious times for rituals required accurate astronomical knowledge. Taoist practitioners observed celestial phenomena, recorded them systematically, and developed predictive models. While their ultimate purposes were religious rather than scientific in the modern sense, the methods and knowledge they developed contributed to Chinese astronomical tradition. The relationship between Taoist investigation of nature and the modern science is contested. Some scholars emphasize continuities, arguing that Taoist naturalism and empirical practices prefigure scientific method. Others stress discontinuities, noting that Taoist purposes, achieving immortality, cosmic harmony, magical power, differ fundamentally from scientific goals of value-neutral knowledge. The truth likely lies between. Taoist practices promoted certain investigative skills and attitudes, while embedding them in religious frameworks quite alien to modern science. The Song period also witnessed the emergence of new Taoist movements. The Quanzhen Complete Perfection School, founded by Wang Chongyang 1113–1170 in northern China during the Jin occupation, would become one of the most important Taoist lineages. Wang taught integration of the three teachings, Daoism, Buddhism, and Confucianism, arguing that their apparent differences masked underlying unity. He emphasized internal alchemy, moral cultivation, and monastic discipline, creating a movement that synthesized elements from multiple traditions. Quanzhen Daoism differed from earlier forms in several ways. It mandated clerical celibacy, unlike most earlier Taoist lineages where priests could marry. It established monastic institutions with strict discipline, similar to Buddhist monasteries. It de-emphasized ritual magic in favor of contemplative practice, and it explicitly sought to transcend sectarian boundaries, presenting itself as a universal path rather than a partisan school. These characteristics gave Quanzhen appeal across different social groups and regions. Wang Chongyang's 7 disciples, known as the 7 Masters of Quanzhen, spread the teaching throughout northern China. They established temples, attracted followers, and systematized Wang's teachings into coherent doctrine. Qu Chuji, 1148-1227, one of the 7, became particularly influential after travelling to Central Asia to meet Genghis Khan and discussing philosophy with the Mongol conqueror. This meeting brought Quanzhen Daoism to the attention of the Mongol rulers who would soon conquer all of China. Meanwhile, in southern China, the Celestial Masters tradition continued under the Zhang family's hereditary leadership. The Celestial Masters had survived for over 1,000 years by their point, adapting to each dynasty's circumstances while maintaining institutional continuity. During the Song, they secured official recognition and patronage, with the Celestial Master receiving imperial titles and authority over Taoist clergy. This gave the lineage political legitimacy and organizational power, though it also made them dependent on governmental approval. The Song dynasty's eventual conquest by the Mongols in 1279 created new challenges for all Taoist lineages. The Mongol Yuan dynasty, 1271-1368, brought foreign rulers suspicious of Chinese religious institutions but also curious about Chinese culture. Taoists would have to navigate this new landscape carefully, finding ways to survive and even flourish under alien rule. The precedents established during the Song, internal alchemical systematization, medical integration, intellectual sophistication, new institutional forms like Quanzhen would prove crucial for this adaptation. The Mongol conquest of China, completed in 1279 with the fall of the Southern Song, brought the Yuan dynasty, 1271-1368, and a new set of challenges and opportunities for Taoism. The Mongols were foreign conquerors who viewed Chinese civilization with a mixture of admiration and suspicion. They patronized both Buddhism and Taoism while also maintaining their own shamanistic traditions. This created a complex religious landscape where different traditions competed for Mongol favor while also contending with each other. Initially, Quanzhen Taoism had an advantage. Qu Chuji's meeting with Genghis Khan in 1222 had impressed the Mongol leader, who granted Quanzhen tax exemptions and authority over all religious affairs in northern China. This gave Quanzhen enormous power and resources. Quanzhen masters established tehsils throughout the north, attracted thousands of followers, and accumulated substantial wealth. For several decades, Quanzhen enjoyed unprecedented influence. However, this success provoked Buddhist opposition. Buddhists at the Mongol court argued that Taoism was native Chinese superstition unworthy of patronage, while Buddhism was a universal teaching suitable for the Mongol Empire's diverse populations. The competition became intense, culminating in a series of debates at court between Taoist and Buddhist representatives. These debates covered doctrinal, historical, and practical matters, with each side trying to prove its superiority. The turning point came in 1258 when Mongke Khan, Genghis's grandson, ordered a formal debate to settle the question definitively. The debate focused partly on the conversion of the barbarian's legend, with Taoists claiming that Laozi had gone west to become the Buddha's teacher. Buddhists produced evidence that this was a fabrication created centuries after Buddhism arrived in China. The Mongol court, which included experts who could verify historical claims about Buddhism's origins, ruled in Buddhism's favour. Mongke Khan ordered the burning of Taoist texts propagating the conversion legend and stripped Quanzhen of some privileges. This setback did not destroy Quanzhen, but it ended their brief period of dominance. Buddhism became the Mongol court's preferred religion, though Daoism continued to receive some patronage. The Celestial Masters lineage, based in southern China, also secured recognition from the Yuan court, receiving official titles and authority over southern Taoist clergy. This created a division where Quanzhen dominated the north and Celestial Masters dominated the south, a pattern that would persist into later dynasties. The Yuan period saw both Taoist traditions continue developing their distinctive practices. Quanzhen refined its internal alchemical system, producing texts like The Secret of the Golden Flower that would later fascinate Western readers. The Celestial Masters developed their liturgical traditions, systematizing rituals and creating standardized procedures. Both traditions established temple networks, trained clergy, and served community needs through rituals, healing, and moral instruction. The Ming dynasty, 1368 to 1644, which overthrew the Mongols and restored Chinese rule, initially showed favour to Daoism. The founding Ming emperor, Hongwu, patronized Taoist institutions and consulted Taoist advisors. However, his support was pragmatic rather than deeply committed. The Ming state wanted to control religious institutions, not give them independence. This led to a policy of regulation rather than promotion. The Ming government established a system for managing Taoist clergy similar to civil service administration. Taoist priests were registered, ranked, and supervised by government-appointed officials. Major temples received official recognition and support, but only if they submitted to state oversight. This system gave the government leverage over Taoist institutions while providing those institutions with stability and legitimacy. Most Taoist lineages accepted this arrangement as preferable to persecution or neglect. However, some Ming emperors became personally devoted to Daoism in ways that troubled Confucian officials. Emperor Jing, R. 1521 to 1567, particularly alarmed his bureaucracy by conducting Taoist rituals in the palace, giving Taoist priests high positions, and neglecting government affairs in favour of seeking immortality. He built elaborate Taoist temples, sponsored expensive ceremonies, and indulged alchemists who promised life extension elixirs. Confucian officials repeatedly memorialized him to abandon these pursuits, but he largely ignored them. Jing's example illustrates a recurring pattern. While Confucian ideology dominated official culture, individual emperors often privately pursued Taoist practices. They sought longevity, health, and esoteric power that Confucian learning could not provide. This created a split between public Confucian orthodoxy and private Taoist heterodoxy at the highest levels of the state. The Ming period also saw continued compilation and publication of Taoist texts. The Ming Taoist canon, completed in 1445, organized more than 400 texts into systematic categories. This canon preserved enormous amounts of Taoist literature from various periods and lineages. Modern scholars studying Daoism rely heavily on this Ming compilation, as many texts survive only in this collection. Popular religious Daoism flourished during the Ming at the local level. Taoist priests served community needs, performing funerals, conducting festivals, exorcising ghosts, healing illnesses, blessing marriages, and protecting against disasters. Taoist temples became social centers where communities gathered for various purposes. Taoist deities were incorporated into local pantheons alongside Buddhist bodhisattvas and Confucian worthies. At the village level, religious boundaries were fluid. People participated in Taoist, Buddhist, and Confucian-influenced practices without seeing contradictions. The Ming also witnessed the creation of new synthetic religious movements that drew on Taoist elements. The most significant was the Hente, Wu Wei, non-action, sect, which combined Taoist ideas about Wu Wei with Buddhist concepts of karma and Confucian ethics. Such movements showed both Taoism's influence on popular religion and the continuing process of integration among the three teachings. Women's roles in Ming Taoism remained limited but not absent. Some women became Taoist nuns, pursuing cultivation in convents. Others served as mediums or healers using Taoist techniques. The tradition preserved hagiographies of female immortals as models, and these stories sometimes validated women's spiritual authority. However, institutional leadership remained overwhelmingly male, and women's opportunities for advancement were constrained by broader social restrictions. The Qing dynasty, seen 1644 to 1912, established by Manchu conquerors from the northeast, brought another period of foreign rule. Like the Mongols, the Manchus had to manage China's complex religious landscape while maintaining their own cultural identity. The Qing adopted a policy of controlled tolerance. Religious institutions were allowed to function, but were carefully monitored and regulated. Anything potentially threatening to social order or imperial authority was suppressed. Qing emperors patronized Taoism selectively. They granted titles to the celestial master and recognized major temples. They occasionally sponsored repairs or expansions of important Taoist sites, but they did not give Taoism particular favor over other traditions, and their support came with strings attached. Taoist institutions had to submit to government oversight, report their activities, and avoid anything that might be construed as politically subversive. The Qing particularly worried about sectarian movements that combined religious ideas with social organization. Such movements could become vehicles for rebellion, as the White Lotus Rebellion, 1796 to 1804, demonstrated. While the White Lotus had Buddhist roots, its example made the Qing suspicious of all non-official religious organizations. Taoists had to be careful not to appear as dangerous sectarians. Despite governmental regulation, Qing Taoism continued to evolve. Internal alchemy became increasingly elaborate and systematized. Texts like The Secret of the Golden Flower and Understanding Reality were widely studied. Some scholars argue that Qing internal alchemy became overly complex and scholastic, losing the experiential vitality of earlier periods. Others see this systematization as natural development of a mature tradition. Quanzhen Taoism experienced something of a revival during the Qing. The White Cloud Temple in Beijing became a major center, producing important masters and texts. Quanzhen institutions spread to southern China, previously dominated by her celestial masters. The emphasis on monasticism, celibacy, and integration of the three teachings gave Quanzhen appeal among educated elites seeking alternatives to conventional Confucian careers. The celestial masters tradition maintained its institutional presence, with the Zhang family continuing as hereditary leaders. However, their actual power and influence declined. The Qing government dealt with them as ceremonial figures rather than meaningful authorities. Local celestial masters priests continued serving communities, but the centralized hierarchy became more nominal than real. Temple Taoism, the network of temples, priests, and local practices, remained vibrant throughout the Qing. Ordinary people continued consulting Taoist priests for practical needs. Temples provided social services, community gathering spaces, and connections to the sacred. The annual cycle of festivals included Taoist celebrations alongside Buddhist and secular holidays. At this grassroots level, Taoism was deeply embedded in everyday life. The late Qing saw China face unprecedented challenges: Western imperialism, military defeat, economic crisis, and social breakdown. These challenges sparked debates about Chinese tradition's viability. Many intellectuals blamed China's weakness on its traditional culture, including religious superstition. Daoism came under criticism as pre-modern irrationality incompatible with modern science and progress. This intellectual critique would intensify in the 20th century, creating existential challenges for all forms of Chinese religion. Yet Daoism proved resilient. Despite political upheaval, intellectual criticism, and social transformation, Taoist institutions survived into the modern era. The tradition adapted once again, finding new forms and functions appropriate to changed circumstances. But the 20th century would test Taoism more severely than any previous period, bringing persecution, destruction, and enforced transformation that nearly destroyed the tradition entirely. The 20th century brought unprecedented catastrophe to Chinese Taoism. The collapse of the Qing dynasty in 1911, decades of warlordism and civil war, Japanese invasion, communist revolution, and especially the Cultural Revolution, 1966-1976, devastated Taoist institutions. Temples were destroyed, texts burned, priests forced to abandon their vocations, and practices suppressed. By the early 1980s, it seemed possible that Taoism might not survive as a living tradition, yet survive it did, and the past 4 decades have witnessed remarkable revival. The late Qing and early Republican period, 1911 to 1949, saw Chinese intellectuals fiercely criticizing traditional culture. The May 4th movement of 1919, responding to China's humiliation by foreign powers and its own weakness, called for modernization through science and democracy. Many May 4th intellectuals viewed traditional religion, including Taoism, as feudal superstition that kept China backward. Confucianism bore the brunt of criticism, but Taoism and Buddhism also faced intellectual assault. Progressive intellectuals characterized Taoism as irrational mysticism, belief in impossible immortality, wasteful ritual, and exploitation of the ignorant by priests selling magical services. Some called for abolishing religion entirely and replacing it with scientific rationalism. This created a hostile intellectual environment where educated Chinese were embarrassed by their religious traditions rather than proud of them. However, institutional Taoism continued functioning during the Republican period, though under difficult circumstances. Warlords controlled different regions, some tolerant of religion and others hostile. Temples depended on local circumstances and patron support. Some major temples maintained operations, training clergy and serving communities. Others declined as patronage dried up and younger generations sought modern education rather than religious vocations. The Japanese invasion in 1945 brought direct physical destruction. Japanese forces destroyed numerous temples across occupied China. The war disrupted pilgrimage networks, scattered communities, and made normal religious life impossible. Many priests fled to unoccupied areas or abandoned their vocations to survive. Some temples that survived Japanese occupation were damaged in the subsequent civil war between nationalists and communists in 1949. The communist victory in 1949 created a state officially committed to atheism and dialectical materialism. Religion was viewed as opium of the masses, false consciousness that would disappear as China modernized and achieved socialism. Initially, the new government tolerated religious practice while gradually reducing religion's social influence. Taoist institutions were allowed to continue but were brought under state control through the Chinese Taoist Association, established in 1957, which managed Taoist affairs under government supervision. The Great Leap Forward, 1958 to 1962, brought increased pressure. Temples were closed or converted to other uses. Clergy were forced into agricultural communes or factories. Religious practice was discouraged, though not yet completely prohibited. The catastrophic famine that resulted from Great Leap policies killed millions and discredited the campaign, leading to a brief relaxation in the early 60s. Then came the Cultural Revolution. Launched in 1966 by Mao Zedong to revive revolutionary fervour and eliminate his political opponents, the Cultural Revolution unleashed a decade of chaos and violence that devastated Chinese culture generally and religion specifically. Red Guards, mostly teenagers mobilised by Maoist rhetoric, attacked the four olds: old ideas, old culture, old customs and old habits. Religion fell squarely into these categories. Taoist temples were ransacked and destroyed. Statues of deities were smashed. Ritual objects were confiscated and burned. Texts were destroyed. Priests were beaten, publicly humiliated, forced to renounce their beliefs, and sent to labour camps or countryside for re-education. The White Cloud Temple in Beijing, Quanzhen's most important institution, was occupied by the military and its contents destroyed. Dragon Tiger Mountain in Jiangxi, the Celestial Master's ancestral seat, was similarly devastated. Countless individual tragedies occurred. Elderly masters who had dedicated lives to Taoist practice were forced to deny everything they believed. Texts preserved for generations were burned. Buildings hundreds of years old were demolished. Lineages of transmission going back centuries were broken. Young people who might have become the next generation of priests instead grew up in an environment where religious practice was criminal. The persecution extended beyond Taoism to all religion. Buddhism, Christianity, Islam and folk religion all faced similar attacks. The Cultural Revolution aimed at nothing less than erasing China's entire religious heritage and creating a purely secular socialist culture. It came terrifyingly close to succeeding. The Cultural Revolution officially ended with Mao's death in 1976, but the damage persisted. China in the late 70s was traumatized, economically devastated, and culturally impoverished. Deng Xiaoping's rise to power and his reform and opening policy after 1978 began addressing these problems. As part of wider liberalization, religious policy gradually relaxed. The government acknowledged that the Cultural Revolution had gone too far and that religious belief should be tolerated, though still managed and limited. The 1980s witnessed tentative Taoist revival. Some temples were reopened and restored, though often as tourist sites rather than functioning religious institutions. Elderly priests who had survived came out of hiding or retirement to resume practice and train new disciples. The Chinese Taoist Association was re-established in 1980, providing organisational structure for the tradition's rebuilding. The government allowed limited religious publishing and education. However, revival faced enormous challenges. The generational transmission had been broken. Many elderly masters died before they could fully train successors, taking irreplaceable knowledge with them. Texts had been destroyed. Building and objects had been lost. Moreover, Chinese society was rapidly modernizing and secularizing. Young people pursued careers in business, technology, and government rather than religious vocations. The social context that had sustained Taoism for millennia, agricultural communities with traditional values, was disappearing. The government's approach remained ambivalent. On one hand, officials recognized religion's cultural value and its importance for social stability and national identity. Traditional culture, including Taoism, became part of China's soft power and national pride. On the other hand, the Communist Party remained officially atheist and concerned about religion's potential to create alternative centres of authority or loyalty. This ambivalence produced a policy of controlled, managed religious revival. The government supported restoration of major temples as cultural monuments and tourist attractions. It allowed religious activity within approved parameters, registered clergy, official organisations, government supervision. What it did not allow was independent religious organisation, public proselytizing, or religious influence in education and politics. Taoism could exist, but only within boundaries defined and enforced by the state. Despite these constraints, Daoism experienced significant revival over the past 4 decades. Major temples have been extensively restored. The White Cloud Temple now functions as a major Quanzhen center with hundreds of resident clergy. Dragon Tiger Mountain has been rebuilt and attracts thousands of pilgrims. Taoist associations operate in provinces and major cities. Taoist academies train new clergy. Scholarly study of Taoism has flourished, with Chinese academics producing important research. Martial arts provided an unexpected avenue for Taoist transmission. Taijiquan, Tai Chi, with its Taoist philosophical foundations, became popular globally as exercise and meditation practice. This spread Taoist ideas, particularly concepts of yin-yang balance and moving with natural flow, to millions of people worldwide. Similarly, Qigong, breath and energy cultivation, attracted Chinese and international practitioners, carrying Taoist health practices beyond explicitly religious contexts. The Internet age brought new opportunities. Taoist temples established websites. Practitioners created online communities. Texts that had been scarce became available digitally. This technological development allowed Taoist knowledge to circulate more widely than ever before, though it also raised questions about authenticity and authority. How does one verify online teachers? How can embodied practices transmitted physically be learned virtually? Contemporary Chinese Taoism exists in complex relationship with modernity. Some lineages emphasize continuity with tradition, carefully preserving ancient practices and resisting innovation. Others adapt creatively, finding new expressions for traditional ideas. Urban temples attract educated professionals seeking stress relief and meaning. Mountain hermitages house dedicated practitioners pursuing intensive cultivation. Tourist sites mix religious function with commercial operation. This diversity reflects Taoism's continued adaptability. The question of authenticity haunts contemporary Taoism. Were lineages genuinely preserved through the Cultural Revolution, or were they reconstructed afterward from fragmentary memories and texts? When elderly masters died without fully training successors, how much was lost permanently? Can revival produce genuine continuation or only approximation? These questions trouble scholars and practitioners alike, and definitive answers are impossible. What is clear is that Taoism survived the 20th century's catastrophes, an achievement not to be underestimated. That survival depended on the dedication of individuals who preserved practices under terrible conditions, on the tradition's flexibility and adaptability, and on its deep roots in Chinese culture. The Taoism that emerged from suppression is different from what existed before, smaller, more constrained, more self-conscious, but it is recognizably continuous with the tradition that emerged 2 millennia ago. While Taoism was struggling to survive in 20th century China, it was simultaneously being discovered, interpreted, and reimagined in the West. This globalization of Taoism created fascinating transformations, as Western readers encountered Taoist texts through translation and interpreted them according to their own cultural assumptions and concerns. The result has been both beneficial, spreading Taoist ideas to new audiences, and problematic, often misrepresenting or oversimplifying what Taoism actually is. The first significant English translation of the Dao De Jing appeared in 1842, produced by a Scottish missionary named John Francis Davis. However, the translations that really introduced Taoism to English readers came later. James Legge's 1891 translation in the Sacred Books of the East series, and Herbert Giles's 1905 translation. Both translators were sinologists approaching Taoism as an object of scholarly study rather than spiritual seeking. Their translations were relatively accurate but stilted, making the text seem foreign and difficult. The watershed came with Arthur Waley's and 34 translation, The Way and Its Power. Waley was a brilliant scholar who made Chinese literature accessible to English readers through elegant, readable translations. His Dao De Jing captured something of the original's poetic power while making it comprehensible to Western audiences. Waley's introduction and notes provided historical context and philosophical analysis that helped readers understand the text as a product of Warring States China rather than timeless mystical wisdom. However, the translator who most influenced popular Western understanding of Daoism was Alan Watts. Watts was not an academic sinologist but a popularizer of Asian philosophy, particularly Zen Buddhism and Daoism. His 1958 book, The Way of Zen, introduced Daoism to Beat Generation readers seeking alternatives to conventional Western culture. His mid-5 book, Tao, The Watercourse Way, published posthumously, presented Daoism as spontaneous, naturalistic philosophy aligned with modern environmental concerns and critiques of industrialization. Watts's interpretation emphasized certain aspects of Daoism: naturalness, spontaneity, wu-wei, harmony with nature, while downplaying or ignoring others, the political philosophy, the religious dimensions, the social context. He presented Daoism as countercultural wisdom, particularly relevant to modern people alienated from technological civilization. This interpretation resonated with 1960s and 70s Western audiences seeking alternatives to materialism, rationalism, and social conformity. The 60s counterculture embraced Daoism as part of a broader interest in Asian spirituality. Young people disillusioned with mainstream Western culture found in Daoism an alternative value system that validated their rejection of conventional success, their desire for authenticity and freedom, and their critique of artificial social constraints. The Dao De Jing became a countercultural classic, read alongside the Bhagavad Gita, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and beat poetry. This countercultural appropriation created a Western image of Daoism quite distant from historical reality. Daoism became associated with hippie values, living naturally, rejecting materialism, seeking enlightenment through consciousness exploration, opposing the system. Chinese Taoists would likely not recognize themselves in this image, but it became dominant in popular Western understanding. The 1980s and beyond saw proliferation of Taoist-inspired self-help books, management guides, and lifestyle advice. Titles like The Tao of Pooh, The Tao of Physics, The Tao of Leadership, and countless others applied Dao to everything from child rearing to organizational management to romance. These books usually extracted some principle from Daoism, typically wu-wei or yin-yang balance, and applied it to contemporary concerns with varying degrees of faithfulness to the original tradition. The most problematic aspect of this popularization was the transformation of Daoism into a technique for achieving personal success. Books promised that applying Taoist principles would improve your career, relationships, health, and happiness. This completely inverted the original message. Classical Taoism advocated letting go of conventional goals like success, wealth, and status. It critiqued the competitive striving that characterizes ambitious people. To market Taoism as a better way to achieve conventional success fundamentally misses the point. The New Age movement embraced Taoism enthusiastically, but in highly syncretistic form mixed with elements from various traditions. New Age Taoism often speaks of the Tao as a cosmic energy or life force that can be manipulated through visualizations, affirmations, and intention. This law of attraction interpretation has no basis in classical Taoist texts and fundamentally misunderstands what the Tao is, yet it remains popular, promoted through books like The Tao of Abundance and similar titles. Martial arts provided another avenue for Taoism's global spread, but also another source of misunderstanding. Taiji Quan became internationally popular as exercise and moving meditation. Teachers are often presented it as embodying Taoist principles of softness, overcoming hardness, yielding to force rather than meeting it directly, and moving with natural flow. This is legitimate. Taiji Quan does have Taoist influences. However, the presentation often simplified and romanticized Taoism, stripping away its complex philosophical and religious dimensions. Western academic study of Taoism developed alongside popular appropriations. Scholars like Christopher Schipper, Isabelle Robinet, Livia Cohn and others produced rigorous historical research on Taoist texts, practices, and institutions. They revealed the complexity of the Taoist tradition, the multiple lineages, the evolution over time, the religious dimensions often ignored by popular presentations. However, academic work reached much smaller audiences than popular books and had less influence on general Western understanding. Translation itself created challenges. Key Taoist terms resist simple translation. Dao is variously rendered as way, path, order, process, or left untranslated. Wu Wei becomes non-action, non-doing, non-interference, effortless action, or actionless action, each emphasizing different aspects. Di is translated as virtue, power, integrity, or potency. Each choice shapes how English readers understand the concepts. No translation is neutral, all involve interpretation. The question of authenticity arises here as in modern China. Is an American practicing Taiji Quan in a park engaged in Taoism? Is a business person applying Wu Wei to management strategy a Taoist? Is someone reading a mass-market translation of the Dao De Jing learning about actual Taoism or a Western invention? These questions have no simple answers. They involve debates about essentialism versus constructivism, about authority and legitimation, about who has the right to define what counts as Taoism. One clear problem is the tendency to spiritualize and individualize Taoism, while ignoring its social and political dimensions. The Dao De Jing offers political philosophy about governance and social organization. The Zhuangzi engages with other schools in philosophical debate. Historical Taoism involved communities, institutions, and social practices, yet Western appropriations often extract decontextualized wisdom for individual psychological benefit while ignoring these broader dimensions. Environmental movements have found resources in Taoism, sometimes more appropriately. Taoist emphasis on naturalness, its critique of human arrogance, its valorization of simplicity and restraint, and its sense of humanity's embeddedness in natural processes all resonate with ecological concerns. Some environmental philosophers argue that Taoism offers alternatives to Western anthropocentrism and provides conceptual resources for environmental ethics. This connection seems more legitimate than many others because it engages with actual Taoist philosophical commitments rather than projecting alien concerns onto the tradition. Feminist scholars have debated Taoism's gender politics. The Dao De Jing frequently uses feminine imagery, the Tao as mother, as mysterious female, as valley spirit. It valorizes qualities culturally coded as feminine, softness, receptivity, nurturing. Some feminists argue this makes Taoism more gender balanced than Western traditions or Confucianism. Others counter that using feminine metaphors doesn't constitute real gender equality, and that historical Taoism remained patriarchal in practice despite its feminine symbolism. The globalization of Taoism has thus been a complex process involving translation, interpretation, appropriation, and transformation. It has spread Taoist ideas to unprecedented numbers of people worldwide. It has inspired various creative adaptations and applications, but it has also frequently misrepresented Taoism, oversimplified it, or projected Western concerns onto it. The Taoism that many Westerners know bears limited resemblance to Daoism as practiced in China or as understood by scholars of Chinese religion. This raises philosophical questions about tradition, interpretation, and evolution. Is Western Daoism a legitimate development of the tradition or a distortion? Can traditions remain vital only by changing as they encounter new contexts, or does such change destroy what made them valuable? These questions apply to Daoism but also to any tradition's cross-cultural transmission. They have no definitive answers, only ongoing negotiation. After examining Daoism's historical development from warring states philosophy through contemporary global phenomenon, we can now assess what this tradition actually offers and distinguish documented reality from popular mythology. This final assessment requires honesty about both Daoism's genuine insights and its limitations, and clarity about how historical Daoism differs from various contemporary appropriations. The historical truth is that Daoism emerged from specific circumstances in ancient China as a philosophical response to political chaos and social breakdown. The core Taoist texts, the Dao De Jing and Zhuangzi, offered alternatives to dominant Confucian and legalist approaches, critiquing their assumptions and proposing different values. These philosophical ideas emphasize naturalness over artificiality, spontaneity over forced action, acceptance over constant striving, and simplicity over complexity. They challenge conventional wisdom about strength, success, and goodness. These ideas were radical then and remain radical now. The suggestion that yielding is more effective than asserting, that emptiness is more useful than fullness, that lowliness is safer than prominence, contradicts most human intuitions and most cultures' dominant values. Yet Taoist thinkers develop sophisticated arguments for these counterintuitive positions, grounded in observation of natural processes and analysis of political and social dynamics. The concept of wu wei, effortless action aligned with natural patterns, remains one of Taoism's most valuable contributions. This principle has application across domains: governance, personal conduct, creative activity, interpersonal relations. The insight that forcing and straining often prove counterproductive, that many things work better with less interference, that going with the grain achieves more than going against it, these remain practically useful observations. The critique of language and conceptual thinking that Zhuangzi developed also retains philosophical interest. His arguments about the limits of language, the relativity of judgments, the arbitrary nature of categorical distinctions, and the possibility of liberation from linguistic constraints anticipate contemporary philosophical discussions in semantics, cognitive science, and philosophy of mind. Zhuangzi's playful, paradoxical style influenced Chinese literary and intellectual culture profoundly and continues to charm and provoke readers. The Taoist emphasis on naturalness and critique of artificiality speaks to contemporary concerns about authenticity, technology, and environmental destruction. When Taoists warned against imposing human will on natural process, against creating elaborate systems that generate unintended consequences, against mistaking cultural convention for natural necessity, they articulated concerns that remain urgent. Industrial civilization's environmental devastation might be seen as a colossal failure to practice wu wei, forcing natural systems beyond their resilience rather than working with their patterns. However, we must acknowledge limitations. Historical Taoism was not egalitarian. It accepted social hierarchy while advocating that rulers govern lightly. The hermit sage ideal, while expressing genuine philosophical commitments, also represented privilege. Most people could not withdraw from social obligations to pursue contemplation. The celebration of simplicity sometimes romanticized poverty in ways that failed to acknowledge poverty's genuine suffering. Taoism's political philosophy, while offering valuable critiques of governmental overreach, provided limited positive guidance for constructing just political institutions. The ideal of minimal government works well in relatively simple societies, but struggles to address the complex coordination problems of modern states. Wu-wei governance at its best promotes restraint and caution, but taken to extremes it becomes irresponsible neglect. Religious Daoism, with its promises of immortality, magical hierarchical powers, and divine intervention, requires different assessment. From a historical perspective, these developments show how philosophical ideas get transformed when they become popular religion. The sophisticated skepticism of Zhuangzi becomes belief in communicating with deities. The naturalistic Tao becomes a personified god. Philosophical acceptance of death becomes pursuit of physical immortality through alchemical elixirs. Modern people can respect religious Taoism as a historical tradition that met genuine human needs, community, meaning, ritual structure, hope amid suffering, without accepting its supernatural claims. The practices of meditation, breathing exercise, and bodily cultivation that religious Taoism developed have value independent of the religious framework. Contemporary practice of Qigong or Tai Chi Quan can be undertaken without believing in immortals or cosmic energies, appreciated simply as effective methods for health and well-being. The modern myth that most needs correcting is the notion that Taoism offers easy answers or quick fixes. Popular presentation suggesting that reading the Dao De Jing or applying some simple principle will solve life's problems misrepresent what Taoism actually proposes. The classical texts describe a demanding reorientation of values, perception, and conduct that requires years of effort. Zhuangzi's sage is not someone who read a book once, but someone who has undergone profound transformation through disciplined practice and reflection. Another myth to dispel is that Taoism is purely individualistic. While it does emphasize personal cultivation and sometimes advocates withdrawal from society, it also offers political philosophy about governing communities and social philosophy about human relationships. The hermit ideal represents one possibility within Taoism, not its entirety. Historical Taoism involved communities, institutions, and social engagement as much as individual retreat. The commercialization and commodification of Taoism in contemporary culture raises troubling questions. When Tao becomes a marketing term slapped onto products, when Taoist principles are sold as success techniques, when sacred texts become coffee table books, something important is lost. This is not unique to Taoism. All traditions face similar commercialization, but recognizing the problem is important for maintaining integrity. What remains timeless and valuable in Taoism? Several things. The epistemological humility, recognizing the limits of human knowledge and the partiality of our perspectives. The ecological sensitivity, understanding humans as embedded in natural systems rather than separate from or superior to nature. The critique of empty status-seeking and competitive striving. The appreciation for simplicity, spontaneity, and what comes naturally rather than forcefully. The recognition that many problems arise from our anxious efforts to control rather than from insufficient control. These insights do not require supernatural beliefs. They are available through philosophical reflection and practical application. Someone can be inspired by Taoist ideas while remaining entirely secular, just as someone can appreciate Stoic philosophy without believing in Zeus. The philosophical core of Taoism, the observations about how to live well, how to act effectively, how to perceive reality more clearly, stands independent of any religious superstructure. At the same time, we should respect religious Taoism as a living tradition for those who practice it. The distinction between philosophical and religious Taoism, while analytically useful, should not become a value judgment where philosophy is deemed superior. Religious practice meets needs that philosophy cannot. Community belonging, ritual structure, sacred meaning, connection to tradition. Chinese Taoists maintaining temples, performing rituals, and training new clergy deserve support, not condescension from Western intellectuals who prefer philosophical texts. The question of what Daoism means today ultimately depends on context. In China, it means a reviving religious tradition recovering from devastating persecution, navigating between state control and authentic renewal, and adapting to rapid modernization. For Chinese people, Daoism connects to cultural identity, historical continuity, and practices inherited from ancestors. It carries weight and meaning that no foreign appropriation can replicate. In the West and globally, Daoism means something different. Philosophical resources drawn from another culture, inspirations for alternative thinking, principles that might inform environmental ethics or personal conduct. This cross-cultural borrowing can be respectful and enriching, or it can be shallow and appropriative. The difference lies in the depth of engagement, the honesty about interpretation, and the recognition of what one does not know. Perhaps the most important thing Daoism offers contemporary people is an alternative vision of human flourishing. Against cultures that glorify constant achievement, maximum productivity, and endless acquisition, Daoism suggests that enough is sufficient, that rest is valuable, that simplicity brings peace, that yielding has its place. Against the arrogance that assumes humans can engineer everything, that problems simply require sufficient control and force, Daoism counsels humility, patience, and respect for what we cannot manage. These are not easy teachings to accept. They go against powerful cultural currents and individual psychological drives. They cannot be implemented through simple techniques or quick adjustments. They require sustained reflection and gradual transformation of one's perspective and values. But for those willing to engage seriously, Daoism offers resources for living differently, not perfectly, not without difficulty, but perhaps with less unnecessary suffering created by our own striving and resistance. The historical truth of Daoism is that it emerged from human reflection on the problems of violence, social breakdown, and the suffering caused by excessive ambition and control. It proposed alternatives grounded in observation of natural processes and critical analysis of conventional values. It developed over centuries through contributions of many thinkers and practitioners, evolving into multiple forms serving different needs. It was never perfect or complete, but it offered genuine insights that retained value across changing circumstances. That is what Daoism was, what it is, and what it might continue to be. Not a miraculous solution to human problems, but a set of philosophical resources developed by people struggling with perennial questions about how to live well, how to govern justly, and how to reduce unnecessary suffering. Those questions remain. The Taoist responses, properly understood in their historical context and carefully distinguished from modern distortion, still deserve serious consideration.